3, 2, 1, and we are off. It's Attwood Unleashed 118, co-hosted by Stephen Knight. Tonight we've got 5 guests, and we are recording the first 2 hours on YouTube, and finally, the second half live on Locals. Link to Locals is in the description box. And one of the reasons is we're going to be talking about those planes that hit those buildings in New York, which we're not allowed to talk to on here. So check out the Locals section. So from 5:45 to 6, as usual, we run down who's coming on and we discuss breaking news stories of the week. And first guest is Richard Grannon. He was on talking about the narcissism of Merkel, Harry, Schofield several months ago. It did really well. And now he's going to be giving us his insights on Jimmy Savile and telling us what he thought of the BBC's The Reckoning. So if you did watch The Reckoning, please put a 1 in the chat so we can get an idea. It is the BBC dramatisation of the Jimmy Savile story. If you've not watched The Reckoning, put a 2 in the chat so we can get an idea of where you are at with that. Richard's specialty is helping people identify, get away, and stay away from narcissistic abuse and heal from trauma. Yes, don't let those manipulative narcissists into your life because they want to suck the resources out of you and drive you insane, especially if you're in a love relationship where they bomb you and trigger you. And it took Richard himself, who was in a relationship with a narcissist, it took him 3 years to recover. And he detailed what happened with that woman in the podcast we did with him earlier in the year. And it's breathtaking. It's a breathtaking story. All right, so 6:30 to 7, we have got Tony Merkel. It's his second appearance. He's a filmmaker, podcaster, CEO of Merkel Media. He's made documentaries on Dogman. But tonight he'll be delving into what made him embark on his latest project to film a documentary on Utah's Skinwalker Ranch entitled The Shape of Shadows. Dun, dun, dun. And then Stephen comes in at 7.
Between 7 and 7:30, making his debut on the show is citizen journalist Ashton Forbes. Ashton will be speaking about an altogether alternative theory behind the disappearance of flight MH370 and whether it came into contact with alien life forms. Ashton is a seeker of truth, organizer of MH370X, an amateur physicist, and believes that teleportation is real. Looking forward to that one. And sticking with the alien content because it makes me feel warm and fuzzy, we'll be joined next by Stephen Diner. Stephen is the host of the Unidentified Alien podcast, where he brings viewers some of the most incredible alien stories out there, which he will be speaking to us about tonight. And then I believe, all going well, Shaun, we switch over to Locals, don't we?
Yeah, and you've got one of my all-time faves.
Yeah, so from 8, I'll be speaking to one of Shaun's all-time favourite guests on the show. That's John Potash. John has been published in Covert Action Quarterly, Baltimore Chronicle, and the Free Press. He has worked counselling people with mental health problems for over 25 years. And in 2015, John released his books, Drugs versus Weapons, Against Us, the CIA murderous targeting of SDS, Panthers, Hendrix, Cobain, and Tupac. So tonight, John will be giving me a primer and a lecture and some enlightening information on the recent arrest 27 years on from Tupac's murder and whether he thinks they have got the right man. Don't know if there's any Tupac fans watching tonight. And then from 8:30 to 9, lawyer Dino Nocivelle is a partner in the abuse department at Lee Day and joined the firm in 2022. Dino specializes in actions for child sexual abuse survivors and has recognized expertise in the following: abuse in football and a number of other sports, abuse within religious institutions, especially the Catholic Church and the Church of England, abuse in the Scout Association, as well as abuse in the military and in private schools and state schools.
Sounds like really important work. And the guy they apprehended regarding Tupac, he had written about it in books, talked about it. I mean, talk about not keeping your mouth shut. What a foolio. All right. So from 9 to 10, author Kevin Ryan will be our last guest on Locals. He's going to be talking about his book, Another 19. This talks about whether the crimes of September the 11th were solely the work of Osama and 19 troubled young Arabs, or were more powerful people involved. And that sounds like a perfect opportunity for another poll. Put a 1 in the chat if you think September 11th was solely the work of Osama and 19 troubled young Arabs. Put a 2 in the chat if you think September 11th there were more powerful people involved. Woo. So, did you watch The Reckoning yourself, Stephen?
I did, and there was quite a lot I liked about it. I think Steve Coogan gave an excellent portrayal of Jimmy Savile. It didn't stray into impersonation, really. I thought it was quite an organic performance. I really liked the fact that they took the time to bookend the episodes with sort of talking heads of the real people who were abused by Jimmy Savile. I thought that was great to put the actual victims front and center. But it still feels a bit strange to me that the BBC made this, given they essentially enabled him in many ways for so many years. And it does feel like the docudrama didn't really go particularly hard on the BBC, which is no surprise, given it was made by the BBC. So I just don't feel that the BBC were really the right people to make this documentary. I think it was a little tamer than it really should have been because of BBC involvement. What do you think?
Well, we interviewed Kelly Gold, and we're going to put that interview up soon. It's in my documentary Untouchable on Savile. And she was a Top of the Pops dancer, and she was a friend of the girl who ended her life. That girl's real name was Claire McAlpine, and that girl had a diary, and the mum read the diary. And in the diary, the girl talked about how the BBC staff members were getting them all drunk and deciding which girl was going to go with whom. But in the dramatization, it just shows Savile in the corridor, like lone wolf, taking this girl into the room. Mick's just pointed out it was made by ITV. Indeed, it was Mick. It was made by ITV, but it was published by the BBC. And I think because of the BBC's input in that, they definitely minimised the complicity in what actually happened. And that diary was actually sent to Scotland Yard. You know, the kid killed herself. And Scotland Yard lost the diary, conveniently. So the other people that she mentioned in it were a very famous DJ in this country besides Savile, and also a huge international star that some people have speculated could be David Bowie.
I was just thinking in my head then, you can't libel the dead, can you? So you're on safe ground there.
Well, that's horrible, isn't it? You know, we're fans of Ziggy Stardust and all that. So if indeed that were the case, but we don't know if that is the case. There's just been some speculation about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I've heard very similar things in that direction over the years too.
What were the most chilling moments for you in The Reckoning, Stephen?
For me, I mean, obviously the sexual abuse is the worst part of any of it. But I think what really irked me the most was the fact that because of his celebrity, he was essentially giving free rein to institutions, hospitals, around. You know, he's allowed carte blanche around some of the most vulnerable people on the planet, and people just allowed him to do it because he was that eccentric bloke off the telly. There didn't appear to be any adults in the room to say, sorry, why are you here? We don't think you should be here. And when they did, it was far too little too late. So I think this obsession and, you know, being impressed with celebrity and letting people get to places where they really shouldn't be solely on their public persona is just such a strange concept to me that never should have happened.
Yeah, a bit that got me was when the woman that was at the school, Duncraft here in Surrey is the real name of it, when she reported it to the police later on, she saw him on Big Brother, she reported it to the cops, she thought something was going to happen. When she got the letter, and I knew there was going to be no further action on that letter, and I almost cried thinking what she must have felt like at that point after going through all that, keeping it inside herself for years, and then the cops just did diddly squat.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking. I mean, it's the thing. I mean, you completely understand in terms of people who've been abused in this way, why they don't report it at the time, especially when it's a high profile person involved. And when they finally get the confidence to do it later down the line, it makes it so much difficult to, gain a conviction and pursue it in the ways that may have been carried out had it been reported earlier. It's just a tragic set of events where there's no justice for these people.
Right, so Stephen Knight's links are in the description box below this video. I'm going to bring in our first guest, Richard Grannon, and we will see Stephen in an hour or so. So cheers, my friend.
You too. Have a good one.
Thanks. Hello there. How's it going, Richard?
Hello, sir. How are you?
Yeah, great. Still reeling from watching The Reckoning. It was extremely harrowing. But before we get to that, Richard Grannon has a massive YouTube channel. He does a lot of videos about narcissism. He was in a narcissistic relationship. I've watched him tell that story multiple times, and I still, my jaw drops every single time. So I urge people, go over to his channel, check out his work, and subscribe. And his links are in the description box. And he had me on his channel as well earlier this year. So cheers for that. And so The Reckoning. What do you make of it?
The case itself, I haven't seen The Reckoning, but watching the case itself, I was, as you were just talking to your guest there, one of the most frightening things was this sort of institutional level narcissism, this collective narcissism that permitted a clearly evil, deranged man to keep getting access to vulnerable people. And I just think, he's obviously a terrible individual, and it's easy to condemn him and lay it all on him. But how many people facilitated it, and what was going through their minds when they were facilitating this behavior? How do they justify it? How do they sleep at night? As you just said, being given access to some of the most vulnerable people in our society.
Do you think it's a case of when a media entity has invested that much into somebody and they've become the most famous person in the country, the ultimate cash cow, they protect the cash cow at all costs until, sometimes it's a case of the public are bound to find out, so then they go into damage limitation mode. But in this case, he got away with it, didn't he?
Yeah, there really needs to be the world has moved on since then. I think it's probably harder to have the kind of power as a celebrity that he had without the information leaking out in the age of technology and social media. But we really do need to look at how celebrities are treated and where the boundaries are drawn. Because just because you're a cash cow and you're drawing in the audience and you're a guaranteed money maker, it doesn't mean that we should throw all moral boundaries to the wind. That's just way too cynical for me. Way too cynical.
So where did Savile score when it comes to tallying up narcissistic tendencies?
Obviously, I've never met him. I'm not a clinician, and you're not supposed to do remote diagnosis. So this is just my opinion. What I'm about to say, he must have been a full-blown malignant narcissist, comorbid with psychopathy, to have done what he did seemingly without remorse, seemingly gleefully for years, knowing that he was causing incredible pain in other human beings' lives just for his own pleasure. There's no real reason for it. It's just that that's what he wanted to do. So he went ahead and did it. We talk about narcissists having a lack of empathy. I think this man must have been devoid of any and all forms of human compassion in order to do what he did.
Richard, so for many of us then, I know you're well versed in this terminology, but for many of us, we need some things explaining. What specifically is a malignant narcissist? So
narcissistic personality disorder, it manifests in different ways in different people. And generally speaking, when you hear clinicians saying a malignant narcissist, this is not somebody who merely feels compelled to be hyper-competitive, merely feels compelled through their own insecurities to put others down and to cheat and to be exploitative. It's kind of another way of saying they're comorbid with psychopathy and sadism. You're talking about probably dark triad, dark tetrad personality types. I'm using more jargon. So the dark triad, dark tetrad, what they've done is they've said some people are so evil, we can't just call them narcissists. We can't just say they have psychopathy. We have to account for their sadism, and we have to account for their Machiavellianism. So you end up trying to pile, triad is 3, tetrad is 4. You have to start adding in order for normal civilized people to. It's baffling for the rest of us. If you have any moral decency whatsoever, it's baffling. And clinicians are human beings, of course, so they come up with these other terms. So malignant narcissism is another way of saying this person is either dark tetrad or dark triad. So they are actually highly sadistic. They're not just doing it as a compulsion because they need to. They're actively engaged in the enjoyment of inflicting pain on another person. The Machiavellianism is he was planning what he did. And he was planning with other people to do what he did. He must have known how it was going to play out. He had a format and a means of entrapping these young people and a whole strategy. And it wouldn't have been just him that knew about it. So that's where we start to say, okay, this is not just, your boss is a bit of a knob and has narcissistic personality disorder traits. This is full-blown malignant narcissism. This person is a narcissistic psychopath, a truly evil piece of work.
So from the sounds of that, Richard, is that the type of narcissist that can do the most damage out of all narcissists, the malignant?
Yes, that would be how it would be defined. So if something is malignant within the body, it's doing damage to the cells around it. Largely speaking, when we say narcissist or psychopath, by the American Psychiatric Association diagnostic coordinates of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, all of the people who are in the cluster B spectrum, they have a negative impact on the people around them. They hurt the people around them actively. They're actively engaged in exploitative and damaging behavior. So malignant means, yes, you're damaging the cells, the culture, the society, the community around you. So that's why we would call it malignant, yeah.
So I think The Reckoning took some liberties, and one of them was they showed Savile as struggling with these contradictory character traits, whereby he was leading the audience to believe that all of his charity work was offsetting his evil. And I think they based that because there was a TV show he was on, and there's a famous quote from it, where he says when he's at the pearly gates and they threaten to not let him in, that he's going to point out how much charity work he has done, and that will forfeit the bad. Do you think he was struggling, or just pure psychopathic, no remorse, didn't give a shit?
I've had a weird life, as you know, mate. Yours. I kept talking to you. You have a much weirder life than me. One of the many jobs I've had over the years is consulting for video games, creators of video games, for the narratives of video games, for novels, and for independent films as well. And what's happened, that I've sat on meetings like this, when you introduce a truly evil character, the writer will start to shy away because they think they're going to lose the audience. They're like, we have to reintroduce some humanity here. And I get it. I 100% understand the drive to not show somebody as evil as they are, because it almost has a numbing effect on the audience. You're just facing pure, unrelenting evil. How's the audience supposed to engage with this character? How are we supposed to invest in him and want to follow along? So I think it's a writer's catch-22. And answer to your question, no, I don't think a man that was capable, because by his deeds, not his words, we can judge him. We know what he did. So we know the level of evil that he was capable of. I seriously doubt a man like that had any capacity for a conscience or any capacity for introspection or doubt in what he was doing. I'm sure he didn't doubt it at all. He probably felt he was entitled to do it because he had the power to do it, which would be a common psychopathic ethic.
Yeah, having researched him and written about him, I have to concur on that, because they showed him in the confessional and he confesses to some low-level sins, but then he says, I need to confess for a friend of mine, and he tells the priest the actual things he's been doing against these young people, his friend. The priest knows what he's saying, but I thought, no way Savile is going to drop a dime on himself like that in some confessional with his very distinct voice and everything else.
No. I think again, it's the writer's conundrum. They just don't want a character who's so unrelentingly evil that relentlessly evil that the audience just will lose their capacity to sort of attach to it in any way. No, I think they've added that, and it's if we're going to follow a character, it makes sense. Like for writers, like we're going to follow this character. If there's nothing in his head but evil, what's the audience supposed to? you need another character to bounce off. In that case, like the only time pure evil has been written that I can remember was by a very psychiatrically informed author, which is Thomas Harris when he wrote Silence of the Lambs. But we see Hannibal Lecter, this kind of purely evil character, we always see him through the eyes of a Clarice Starling. So yeah, no, I don't think he was going to confession or wrestling with his enormous guilt.
Yeah, and Hannibal Lecter, because I've read that, and he kind of ingratiates you with how cultured he is, and he's listening to classical music and reading, classics. All right, so we're with Richard Grannon right now. If you've got any questions for him about Savile, about narcissism, put them in the chat. And we've got our first question from A Nexus. Are the dark tetrads insane? I.e., Savile looked totally insane. Just looking at him, my crazy detector went off upon first gaze. So are these people clinically insane? Because he come across to me as quite calculating, methodical, cunning.
It was actually raising Hannibal Lecter again. It's one of the Hannibal Lecter's first enemies that puts him into prison is Will Graham. And one of the lines in the books is that Will Graham says, "Yes, you're far more intelligent than me, Dr. Lecter." Dr. Lecter says, "But you still managed to catch me." And Will Graham says, "Yes, I have an advantage." Dr. Lecter said, "What is that?" And he replies, "You're insane." Yes, they are insane. When you're talking about these types of people as successful as they may seem to be, as calculating as they may seem to be, they are, we know, fulfilling a grandiose delusional fantasy that represents a kind of an ongoing psychosis. They've had a break with reality because of genetic factors, trauma in childhood, environmental factors. Yeah, they are, and to all intents and purposes, insane, yes.
So one of the areas that the dramatization did show that I didn't think it would show was Savile in the morgue. And how does that factor in to all of the other tendencies you have covered here? I mean, is that something completely next level for these people?
I haven't read much of the literature on necrophilia, but I've read a little bit. I know it's not massively common even amongst career criminal psychopaths. I imagine it would be part of that narcissistic, psychopathic, grandiose fantasy of being godlike. So there's the element of they're breaking a terrible taboo, because in all cultures all across the world, you don't touch dead bodies, you don't do things to dead bodies, and also it's power. I'm alive, you're dead. I can do absolutely whatever I want to you. So it's still part of this psychotic delusional fantasy that I mentioned earlier. But thankfully, as far as I know, it is quite rare.
Next question is, how much did his relationship with his mother cause his personality disorders? So in the dramatization, and I don't know how accurate it is because there's not much information about his relationship with his mother, but in the dramatization, it showed he was a real mummy's boy, but she didn't love him. She said she went into the confession. She told the priest, he was my 7th kid. I didn't want him. I don't love him. So he was always craving her attention. Now, his relationship with her was extremely peculiar. You know, they lived together. He bought her a property in Scarborough. They went on cruises together. And he said she was the only woman in his life. You know, he wasn't allowed to have long-term relationships because he only had space for his mother, and his mother would chase the women out of the house, things like that. And then when she died, he did get to spend considerable time with her body. He kept her clothes hung up in the house for years and had them dry cleaned periodically, and he would caress them. And so what do you make of that, Richard?
Ew. Ew, in my professional opinion. Gross. I think there's plenty of research on criminal psychopathic types having an excessively enmeshed relationship with their mother. I'm immediately reminded of the Cray twins. It can be very, very, very damaging to a young person growing up, whether they're male or female, if they have a mother who is both smothering and ostentatiously loving and wanting to show the appearance of being a loving mother, but not actually providing that love and making them feel very, very cold. The narcissistic personality disorder typically requires the child to be forced into this polarity where their minds are pulled apart, basically, where they're being told, you're wonderful, you're amazing, you're incredibly special, you're the best of the best. But at the same time, they're receiving this contradictory signal, but they're in a catch-22 and they're not allowed to point it out, which is that they're not lovable, that they're useless, that they are, because for a child, for a mother not to love you is a kind of death. And I think that is effectively what happens in narcissistic personality disorder. The authentic, vulnerable, emotional parts of that young human being kind of go through a sort of death. And they never, and this is just my opinion, not the orthodoxy, I don't think they ever recover from that.
So does that contribute to the sadism then? If they've felt they've gone through a death, does them hurting other people give them back the power?
I think so. I think it's a case of getting back that power that they feel that they've lost. I usually associate sadism with a lot of frustration. So if a child has really, so if there's been aggression in the environment and they've been treated with quite a bit of violence, and then they're having their needs and their wants and their drives actively suppressed, and they're in an enmeshed relationship with one or both parents where the parent is quite aggressively putting their adult needs into the child. It doesn't necessarily need to be actual sexual, physical incest. There is something called emotional incest. It can just be a very inappropriate relationship with the child. That's where I see sadism coming out. It's like this boiling rage with a strong desire to take revenge, but it's boundaryless. They don't remember that it's their mother or their father they're furious with. They're sort of angry with the world. So anyone will do.
Next question is from Jean. How do you react to these types of people, for instance, when the door is locked and you're on the wrong side?
Well, me personally.
Well, what advice would you give to people who are, they end up in a room with a Savile type?
Flattery, play for time. They are vulnerable. Their vulnerabilities are that they're childlike, they're impressionable, and they're vain. So if you're playing for time in the hope that somebody else comes along and you can escape the room, however you got into that situation, flattery there. It's kind of not kryptonite because it doesn't disempower them, it empowers them, but it makes them drunk. So you give them an overdose of narcissistic supply. They'll usually, aggression will not always, because if they get onto what you're doing, they could become very aggressive. If you do it subtly, if you're clever, it's a kind of catnip. So they will kind of become drunk and hypnotized, and they'll just want to hear more and more and more. So it's what is known in complex post-traumatic stress disorder. That's a fawning response, but it could work. I'm not saying it's guaranteed to, but it could help.
The more Savile got away with it must have made him more power hungry and entitled. Do you agree, Richard?
Yes, I do. Not everybody believes in this, and not everybody agrees with it. But I think it's got some legs. The idea that narcissism and psychopathy is a kind of other people have said this. It almost, you can see how it could go over and interlock with ADHD type symptoms, and by that I mean the adrenophilia, the love of your own adrenaline, and the need to be stimulated and to go for that rush. Once you've broken those social taboos, which is what psychopaths do, that's the psychopathic element of this character, is breaking the social taboos. That's why they end up getting arrested and potentially in prison. You're going to need more. It's not going to do it's not. So there's two hits if you're a narcissistic psychopath. You have narcissistic supply. People worship you. They're applauding you. You're so funny. You're so wonderful, Mr. Savile. The way you are with these kids is great. It's entertaining. Take some money. So he thinks he's amazing and special. The audience agrees. His employers agrees. He gets narcissistic supply. That's a high. The psychopathic supply will be more in terms of him getting what he wants. So he wants that power. So there's a hit from that. And he wants to break boundaries. He wants to do that which other people cannot do and which only he has the power to do. So yes, that would be like a drug. You would get your high. You'd snort the line of power, but then obviously it would come down again. And they tend to cycle. So we know with narcissists, they go through narcissistic elation. They got the drug, they got their high, then depletion. They become quite depressed and hungry again. And there is a cyclical pattern amongst psychopaths as well, especially if they're comorbid with borderline personality disorder. So yes, is the short answer to your question.
So, which leads to the question, if they are breaking boundaries then, once a boundary is broken multiple times, to get the same high, does the bar have to be raised whereby they do something even more taboo?
I would think so. So I think we've discussed this before, and I think let's say they broadly fall into two categories. There are people who really want to do this thing, and this thing happens to be taboo. Now, they may coast along for 10, 20, 30 years doing this one taboo thing. Let's say, that's an unfortunate example. Let's say it is necrophilia, as in this case. They really want that. They get it. They're happy with that. That's one level of narcissistic psychopathy. What if the person is addicted to breaking taboos themselves? Any taboo. Just give me a fresh taboo. Just give me a new terrible thing to do. Then yes, you're going to be in this cycle of just needing to do worse and worse and worse things, because you're not getting pleasure from the thing itself. You're getting pleasure from the breaking of the thing itself. And that's infinite. You'll never satiate that. That's a really dangerous personality.
Yeah, because we interviewed an ex-Scotland Yard detective, John Wedgett, on Sunday. If the viewers want to check that one out, it's called Was Jimmy a Fixer for the Elites? And he touched on Savile's bizarre relationship with Peter Sutcliffe, because Savile was actually questioned about one of the Yorkshire Ripper's murders. The corpse was left outside of his flat, and there's speculation that it was kind of an offering to Savile. But looking at it from Savile's perspective, what Wedgett speculated was that Savile did want to do things that were increasingly taboo, and he idolised the Yorkshire Ripper because the Yorkshire Ripper was doing things that Savile fantasised about doing but wouldn't do himself.
I actually have personal experience of this, and it relates to the question of being stuck in a room with a psychopath. I've had a narcissistic psychopath tell me that he wants to kill. In his case, he was talking about killing women, but that he didn't have the courage to do it, and that he actively admired killers who could. He said, I don't have the stomach for it, but I fantasize about it. I wish I could do it. One of the weirdest and most unpleasant conversations, probably the most unpleasant conversation I've ever had in my life. But yes, so I think he probably idolized. Well, see, people think psychopaths don't have any ethics or morality. They do have a code. It's just upside down and twisted. So in Savile's sick mind, he might look at a Sutcliffe and think, what a great guy. Wow, the courage that he has to do what he does. I wish I had that wonderful positive attribute. Which is why when writers come along and they have to write this stuff, civilized normal people, they can't really get their hands around it. They can't get around because it's so beyond normal everyday life for the rest of us.
So we've got a question from Patrick. How did Savile schmooze the royal family? What do you make of that?
I get a big conspiracy theory on that one. It's very, very creepy. It's very, very creepy. I don't really know what the royal family is. I have more questions than answers on that one. I wouldn't go so far as to say that anybody in that family would be aware of what he was doing and want to be actively involved. but maybe some researchers out there may want to consider the possibility. And the royal family's big. I'm sure there's compartmentalized behavior that maybe just one or two figures in the royal family would engage with. But otherwise, I've no idea how he got access, regular access to them. Why would they want to be associated with a commoner? And not only that, an entertainer. It really doesn't make sense.
So Jenny's asking if Savile's real-world behaviour indicated that he knew his mother didn't love him.
Yes, I think that's a good question, and I think that's a good summation. And it could be one of those things. You know, I have worked for the probation service in the UK. It could be one of those things where you sit opposite a criminal. You sit across somebody who's mentally ill, and that could have been, say we were having a normal conversation and I was appealing to his vanity, and I was just keeping him pumped. And then at one point I just gently drop in the question, you know, do you feel like your mother loved you? Or do you feel like there were indications that your mother didn't love you? That could create a small break in the narcissistic shield, possibly. It's possible. And I've seen that happen. That, you know, he may become upset, he may become enraged, or he may become very, very sad. But yes, it does indicate that on some level, maybe not consciously, but on some level, he knew he wasn't loved.
Jan is wondering whether people are born being narcissistic, or is it triggered during childhood?
I've always been very much on the side that it's nurture, not nature. But that's partly because of how I was trained at university when we did psychology. That was the way everything leaned. It does seem to me to be a largely learned response, but there is an evolutionary psychologist I speak to sometimes called Professor Ed Dutton, and he's told me that there is pretty solid evidence that there are genetic factors to this as well. So it could be an epigenetic thing. There may be latent narcissistic traits, and then the environment will activate them genetically. But at this point, I'm more on the side of saying it's trauma, but I accept that there are epigenetic factors here.
And how variable can that trauma be?
That's a really, really good question. So if we hold on to the genetic thing, if somebody had, let's say that model is the correct one, that it's epigenetics, it's not just genes, it's not just environment, it's both. And it's how the environment affects the expression of the genetics you're born with. So let's say I have very high latent narcissism and you have very low latent narcissism genetically. And we're both raised in the same environment with largely the same pressures. Maybe there's only 2 years between us as brothers. And so the parents are largely the same age, going through the same economic struggles and whatever else, the same cultural environment. And I become a full-blown narcissist and you don't. That's where we could see the genetic factors there. And maybe, like you said, how variable is it? Maybe the trauma wasn't even that bad. It's just that I didn't need much of a trigger. There was a trigger, there was trauma, but I didn't need much to become a full-blown narcissistic personality disordered human being.
I see. What % of people are narcissists?
You're going to get all kinds of answers online now. You've got doctors, psychiatrists saying that it's as high as 30%, 40%. I seriously doubt that. I think the problem that we're facing, I'm not going to bore people with like academic like arguments, but there is something that has to be resolved within psychiatry, which is they need a better definition between narcissists and people with full-blown narcissistic personality disorder. People who we're calling narcissists, who have highly pronounced narcissistic traits, could go to therapy if they so choose. And after years of genuine, authentic effort, I believe that they could change. Full-blown narcissistic personality disorder, that's a person who's had a full psychotic break with reality, and I don't believe that they're reachable. Full-blown narcissistic personality disorder, I would go by the old statistics from 8-10 years ago and say that's 1 to 3% of the population. It's still quite rare. We do live in a time when narcissistic traits are inflamed. That's the nature of the culture and the economy that we're in right now.
So for malignant narcissists, then it's going to be an even smaller fraction, isn't it?
I would think so. But yeah, I mean, the other thing to think about, like if you just ramp the numbers up, say if we say, oh, it's 1%, That's 1 in 100 people. So you start saying 1,000, 1 million, whatever the UK is now, are we 61 million, 62 million people? If it was as high as 30%, that I don't think the culture would function. I think everything would just fall apart, because they poison the environment that they're in. If every human being is regularly in contact with, let's say, 10 to 20 other human beings, and all those 10 to 20 other human beings are being abused narcissistically, I really think culture would fall apart. I don't buy it.
So we've not got a question from Joe, but I thought this was an interesting comment to get you to comment on. My ex-husband is a malignant narcissist. He became a lieutenant colonel so he could kill lots of people. 5 tours on purpose. What do you make of that?
I know a guy, not professionally, but he's a friend of mine who took that route. Yes, he went on tours, and then when he finished, he went private, and it was for that reason. He started working for private military and got even more of what he was looking for. That's malignant narcissism, but that's beyond narcissism. That is psychopathy. If they're actively enjoying killing people, you're talking about a psychopath as well.
That's what I thought. So is that actually a good use of a psychopath? Because even though these guys are thrown in prison these days, if you go back hundreds of years, wouldn't they have were the first to jump up and grab the axe and lop the heads off the invading Vikings or whatever?
Yeah, I think there's a good argument for that. I think there's even an argument in psychology, or a book that was written about it called The Warrior Gene. You might need a certain number of people in any community of humans who are psychopaths, who have a bloodlust, who do want to actively go and hunt and terrorize the enemy with sadism. It's not very nice to say, but if we're not living in civilized times, these are actually adaptive traits. In other times, it wouldn't be enough to simply want to subdue the enemy or keep them away from you. You would want, probably a controversial point, you want real lunatics on your side who are sadists, who are going to actively terrorize the enemy to make sure they never return to your shores again.
Right, this is going to be the last question because we've almost run out of time. We've got to keep it under a minute, the answer. Gene is wondering, what professions do narcissists pick mostly to feed their illness?
There's research on this between, if you go to Google Scholar and look up professions and narcissism, there is actually pretty good published research on this. They go for positions of power. That's how I would answer that question quickly. They are where you would expect them to be. All
right. Huge thank you for spending time with us, Richard. Can you tell the viewers where they can find you and support you and follow you and stalk you?
If you would like to stalk me and support me and follow me, if you put Richard Grannon, Grannon into YouTube, you will see I'm pumping out content all day, every day, whether people like it or not.
Same here. Cheers to that. Thanks for joining us, man. It's always a pleasure. And take care, my friend. Toodaloo.
Bye-bye.
Bye. All right. We're going to bring Tony Merkel in now. And it's his second appearance on our channel. He's a filmmaker, podcaster, CEO of Merkel Media. He's made documentaries on Dogman, and tonight he's delving into what made him embark on his latest project to film a documentary on Utah's Skinwalker Ranch entitled The Shape of Shadows. Hey, Tony, how's it going, my friend?
Hey, how are you?
Good to see you.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Let's just tell the viewers a little bit about you first. What got you into this?
Yeah, I'm a retired trucker now, turned media mogul. I was a truck driver, started a podcast in the paranormal field, and started interviewing people on their paranormal experiences. And the show grew a lot. I started back in 2017 when the competition wasn't as strong as it is today. But we have a larger podcast, and then what we decided to start doing was going to the scene of these incidences that are, some of the legendary incidences on the show. Tomorrow I'm coming out with episode 592, so I can't go to all 592 places, but some of the legendary stories on the show we try to visit and spend a week on scene documenting our journey.
And what got you into Skinwalker?
Well, it started with episode 202. So a long time ago, I had a guy on my show, and he had an interesting story where he didn't really know much about skinwalkers. He didn't know what Skinwalker Ranch was. And he was in the area of Skinwalker Ranch, and he's driving his truck, and he saw an elderly person walking down the road. And when he approached, he stopped and asked if they needed help, if they needed a ride. He said they didn't say anything to him. They just opened the truck door and sat down inside. And the next thing he knew, he was hanging out his truck down the road, catatonic, just out of it. Ooh. He calls the police, and the reservation police come out, and he tells them what happens, and they told him, you were nabbed by a skinwalker. And so he's like, what's a skinwalker? And so he starts researching it, and he totally gets taken over by it. And he somehow now he doesn't live in Utah. He lives in a different state, but somehow he convinced his wife to allow him to buy property that borders Skinwalker Ranch for research purposes. And and with her blessing, he bought about 10 acres on that borders Skinwalker Ranch, and he calls it Space Wolf Research. And I asked him, I said, why did you settle the name Space Wolf Research? And he said it literally is because of the sheer amount of UFO sightings and upright walking dogs that people see in this area. And so he said, I'm just going to call it Space Wolf Research. And so during that interview, I asked him, I said, do you let people come out and do any kind of investigations? And, back when I asked him that, I was still driving truck. I was not in the position to do a trip like that. And he said, no, that they don't let anybody on the properties for private use only. And then after we were done recording, he goes, dude, you're totally coming out. And I was like, oh, perfect. He just didn't want to say it publicly and have a bunch of people asking. So I put that in the back of my head. And we last year in, I believe, June last year, me and my team went out to Space Wolf Research to spend a week out there. And what we wanted to do was to not only document the weird stuff that happens, because you can't really control that if it happens or not, but to get the Native American perspective on it, because a lot of people know about Skinwalker Ranch. It's hot in the news. People talk about it all the time. And what we wanted to do was to show the world that this is not a phenomenon that stops at the fence line of Skinwalker Ranch, but this is something that is in the entire Uinta Basin. And it turns out what happened is back in the 90s, the Shermans, they bought this ranch. They were the first white people to own it outside the Native Americans. And apparently it really kind of broke some rules. You weren't even supposed to sell that land to anybody that wasn't Native. And they wound up buying it, purchasing it, and they started experiencing all this weird phenomenon, these upright walking dogs, UFOs, portals opening up, hauntings and Bigfoot, all this crazy stuff. And they were kind of freaking out about it and made news. And so when they started talking about this Skinwalker phenomenon, it became known as Skinwalker Ranch. But in reality, the natives were just like, this is something that happens all the time. And so we wanted to get the native perspective when we went out there, knowing that we couldn't, on demand get the activity. Fortunately for us, we did get a lot of activity and we were able to document that, but it was a really wild journey for sure.
So you've mentioned quite a lot of different incidents across a variety. Is there like a grand catalogue of the total amount of things that have been documented? Do we know anything like that?
Yeah. So I don't know if there's somebody has everything filed, but I can tell you that if you heard of it, it's probably happened at Skinwalker Ranch. It's one of those places where I kind of call it like the thinning of the veil, a portal location in general, where people, these weird things seem to happen. And a lot of people kind of come into these topics with their own opinions and perspectives on how it all works and stuff. But it definitely seems like there's something going on above the ground, on the ground, and below the ground. They've detected a lot of anomalies inside the earth in this area. The property that we were on actually had magnetic anomalies that are so strong that we believe are responsible for moving an entire trailer on the property. A week before we got out there, Ryan called me and said that they had a 40-foot container on the property for storage. Those containers that are on shipping yards, those big things, thick metal, heavy. He said that it lifted up and moved. It rotated 90 degrees and then was dropped down. It actually hit the shed that it was sitting next to. And so when we went out there, we actually did some investigation on that, trying to understand, how is this possible? Did somebody, come on the property with a crane and move it to pull a prank? We called companies that rent out heavy machinery in the area. Nobody rented anything out. The property keeper on the property there, the caretaker, he lives right next to the only entrance to the property. And his job is to live on the property, be on the property. So he's always there. And he never heard a tractor trailer backing into the property down this dirt driveway to move it, such a trailer with heavy machinery. And only thing we can figure is that the magnetic anomaly underground had some kind of burst of energy where it pushed this thing up and moved it. But it didn't go too high because there's no drag marks on the ground where this thing could have been drug. It was literally lifted up. But there are about 4 or 5 rocks that were about 5 inches out of the ground, but they were still in the hole that they were sitting in for a long period of time, and the tops were scraped. So this thing wasn't lifted very high, but it was lifted high enough to rotate and move on the property a little bit. It was very bizarre.
Wow. So if anyone has questions for Tony Merkel, put them in the chat wherever you are watching this. And we're talking about Skinwalker Ranch. So Margaret is wondering whether Louis L'Amour wrote a story about this.
I'm not even sure who Louis L'Amour is, but I would say if you've heard of Skinwalker Ranch, possibly, right? Because this is just something that really has been around for quite a while. I mean, since I was a kid in high school. I mean, I graduated in 2003, and Skinwalker Ranch was talked about back then. And, for me, I was kind of on the weird side. I like talking about this stuff, but yeah, Skinwalker Ranch has been around for a while. These phenomenons have been around for a while. And the Skinwalker idea, you get a lot of different perspective depending on who you're talking to. So for my understanding, a Skinwalker itself is somebody who wanted to possess very dark, evil magic. And the only way to do it was to go through certain rituals. Part of that process was to sacrifice a loved one, and not just like somebody who you liked that was your next door neighbor, but this has to be somebody that, a parent, a spouse, a child. There has to be a real emotional connection to the person. And that kind of draws the picture as to what kind of people we're dealing with that would even be able to become a Skinwalker. These are people who are just dark individuals to begin with and want more of the darkness. And we believe we came across a ritual circle that was a Skinwalker ritual circle while we were out there. And it was pretty shocking.
So Kaz is wondering, what is the guy's name who bought the ranch after Bigelow, and does he still own it?
He does still own it, and it's really funny because I am drawing a blank right now as to what his name is, and I should know that. But yeah, the guy who bought it after Bigelow, he is it's going to bother me. It's going to come to me after I'm done talking with you. But he is a real estate guy in Utah, a very wealthy guy, and has always been fascinated by the ranch itself. And so when it came up for sale, he purchased it and then started his own research. And so we had talked to people who owned the property or worked on the property during Bigelow. There's a guy named Chris Bartell. He is former military. He spent, I think, 6 years as security on the property and has documented a lot of wild things. And now what they're doing on the ranch is they're trying to understand the scientific nature of the phenomenon. And I think the more they've dove into the science of it, the more they've circled back around to, this is really weird, and I don't have any science to explain what we just experienced, especially when you have like a scientist who is out there really trying to do the scientific perspective, and he sees lights on the ground, like hovering above the ground that there's just no explanation for, and he has no explanation for it. Brandon Fugel, that's what it was. That's the name. Brandon Fugel is the name of the guy who owns it now. Thanks for the comments there.
Gene is wondering whether Brandon lives there, or did you say he lives in Utah?
Brandon, yes, he lives. I believe he has his main offices in Salt Lake City. And he made his name in the real estate world, commercial real estate, I think it is. But all it takes is for somebody who has real passion for this stuff and the funds to back it up to really do a dent in the whole understanding of these topics. And that's what he is trying to do. Got a lot of respect for him, for sure. We didn't have the opportunity to be on the ranch because it's privately owned. That's why we went to Space Wolf Research, which is actually right against like the fence. They share a fence, but it was a wild experience being out there and seeing. I've seen things that have been on the Skinwalker Ranch show that I've seen with my naked eye, and I know it's real. So it's one of those things where, for me personally, and people have to take my word on it, right? But for me personally, find it very fulfilling to know that I've seen things on their show that are really weird, and I saw it with my naked eye, and it's just for me to confirm that this area has a lot of just really weird things happening in it.
What was the case of the tracks that transformed from human to horse?
Yeah, that was the first day we were out there. So we were driving across the country to get there. We decided since then we're not doing that anymore. We're going to fly because it took like 30 hours to get there. And so we actually made a song about it. It's called 30 Hours to Utah. So, but we are on the way, and my producer, Joseph, and one of the camera guys, Christian, had arrived a day early doing what good producers do, arranging things. And they wound up catching a UFO in broad daylight shooting across a valley. And so we were really excited getting out there. We arrive on scene, we park my truck, and we just start exploring this whole area, the whole property, walking around. And we go down this hillside over a creek, down this pathway. And I believe it was one of my guys, Joel, who first discovered the trackway. There was this small trail that was going off the main pathway down into a flat area, and there was a human footprint right off trail. And what it was the area must have been very saturated at some point, a lot of mud, because the human footprint was about 4 to 5 inches deep into the ground. So the ground must have been very muddy when this was made. And you see this footprint, and it's kind of like parallel with the path we were on. And then you see the trackway, the person turned and started walking down the hill. And as you follow the tracks going down the hill, all of a sudden the human tracks are gone. And I remember, this is muddy ground that these things were made in. So it's not like it was just all of a sudden solid ground. And we know that because it wasn't that the footprints were just gone, but then new footprints arrived. And the new footprints that arrived were not human, but horse. It was hoof prints just as equally deep into the mud. And when we found it, I'm out there and I'm trying to be objective, and I'm trying to, think, how is this possible? And I just came to the understanding that this happened because somebody had a horse. They were walking down the hill, and then they decided to hop up on the horse, and that's why their footprints disappeared. The problem with that is when we walked back up the hill where we found the footprints, there were no horse prints where we found the human footprints. It was human footprints only, and then all of a sudden they're gone and there's horse prints. And we were kind of scratching our head at that, and we found we got in contact with 2 different natives that live on the reservation out there, and they both came out independently to observe the tracks and also the ritual circle. And they both came to the same conclusion separately, that the trackway was done by a shapeshifter, a skinwalker. And so that kind of set us off on the week journey where, the first day you're on scene, before you even get there, you catch a UFO. And then before you even really get a dent into your investigation, you find this trackway. It felt like that kind of marked the whole week for us of adventure and excitement.
So this land then, how big is it? And was some of it a burial site?
Yeah, so the whole area apparently is burial sites. There's just this was an area where they buried their dead. And the property that we had permission to be on, we ventured off the property, not on the Skinwalker Ranch because we're not into getting arrested. At least our wives don't want us getting arrested. But we explored Space Wolf Research, which was about 10 acres. Since then, he's doubled it. It's now 20 acres. And we went all over the place. Now, this whole area apparently is burial sites, and you don't really know exactly where everybody was buried. It's not like everything is a mound. And what's interesting is they say that when you disturb these burial sites, that's when the activity stirs up. The natives, I don't know who's in charge and who's making decisions, but there was a decision made to allow oil drilling on the land. And we were so close to an oil drill while we were out there camping that we could hear the oil drill all night long just humming as it's pumping oil in through the ground. In fact, you actually see it several times throughout the documentary because part of the property that we had permission to be on butted up against this whole land that had the oil drilling going. And so but everybody that we talked to said that the oil drilling is stirring up a lot of activity in that area. Not too long before we arrived, maybe a few weeks beforehand, the neighbors across the street said that they had seen an upright walking dog walking through the property that we were staying on. And so they said that once they started drilling, that's when the activity really started kicking up. Hauntings, people seeing shadow figures in their homes, little girl entities popping up in people's home. In fact, the property caretakers, the little house that he lived in, he had that happen where there was a little girl that just slowly arised out of the floor. He saw her coming up out of the floor, and listen, I think I'd rather see like a monster charging me than seeing a little girl coming up out of the floor. That is some scary stuff.
So a question from Margaret. Have you ever heard of Zabrinsky's Point?
I haven't. I have not at all, actually. That's not even something I could say, oh, I think I've heard of it. I don't know what that is at all.
So you mentioned UFOs. What's the range of sightings in the sky?
Tons. Absolutely tons. This was the sequence of events that happened when we went out there. We find the trackway, and that night we find the ritual circle. Real quick, the story with that is my cameraman and I decided to go down where we found the trackway. And this was like one of those things where it's like, oh yeah, I got game trail cams. I forgot I had them. So it's already dark out and I don't want to go by myself because I'm scared. And so I get my cameraman to come with me, but his camera isn't great in low light situations. And we hadn't unpacked the night vision yet. So he didn't bring a camera with him. He comes down just more for security. We find a tree that we thought would be good because it pointed in the direction of the path that we had found with the prints. And as I'm getting ready to turn and look around me to make sure that he's there and there's nothing coming up behind me, I find that he's not there behind me. He's probably about 20, 30 feet away from me with his back towards me, head looking down at his feet, hands in his pockets. And he looked like he was possessed. And I'm just like, what the heck? And then I look down at his feet and I see this big skull of a cow. And I that's all I saw. And so I said, is that what I think it is? And he goes, yep. And so I said, okay. And so I hung the camera and I come walking over. I'm thinking we're going to have a fun little thing to kind of maybe take up the hill to the guys and scare them coming out of the bushes. When I got up to him, I found out that he wasn't just looking at a skull, but he was looking at multiple skulls and bones, and it was in the form of a circle. There was a bowl in the middle with offerings, and it was clearly a ritual circle, which later the natives that had come out for the trackway had also identified that was actually a ritual circle for skinwalkers as well. So we were kind of on edge, and we go up there and we sit down around the fire, and I approach the guys. I'm like, I need you guys to listen to this, what we found. We had taken a picture of it with Ward's phone because it took really good low light pictures. And we're passing it around the campfire. And as the guys are looking at it, one of the guys says, look, lights on the mesa. And this is where I say what happened next. We actually saw it with our own eyes, but it also appeared on the TV show that people are familiar with. We look across the valley and there is this giant, I'm talking very large light shooting up into the sky from the ground. And this light was like, it wasn't like a spotlight. Like you say, you had a big spotlight and you're just shooting into the sky. This was probably, but from our vantage point, being able to see it as far away we were and how wide it was that we could see, it had to be at least 50 to 100 feet wide. Whatever was the source of this light was very large, and it was shooting this beam up into the sky. And this actually I saw on the TV show as well after we shot our own footage. And so we were able to take a picture of it because we had gotten a better camera out, and we took a picture of it. And so that's in the documentary. But right when that happened, the sky just lights up with tons of UFO activity, and it lasted for hours. It wasn't just something that happened slowly, and it was like, did we see what we think we know what we saw? We documented. We had hours of footage of UFOs, lights going in the sky, going different pattern formations, changing colors, not moving and changing colors, and we were just like, you've got to be kidding me. Looking back on it, I feel like we might have. I don't know. It just seems like the area welcomed us that night, if that makes any sense. It was just like, oh, we know what you guys are here for, and we're gonna give you a little party to show.
Next viewer question is, does the government know full well about this paranormal activity, and are they trying to use the energy for their own nefarious reasons?
Yes. Yes to all of that. I'm I'm somebody who doesn't really trust my government further than I can throw a rock. So the government definitely does know about it. Harry Reid was a senator. He's retired now, and he was involved in the research on the property during the Bigelow administration. And there's been a lot of things uncovered scientifically. And it's a real phenomenon that's been documented by the government. There have been millions of dollars of our own tax-paying money poured into this property to be studied. And as far as energy and nefarious means, I can certainly tell you that your next guest will have a lot to say about that. I saw your roster for today, and I can promise you, Ashton Forbes knows quite a bit about the energy that it takes to make things happen in the sky. So yeah, I'd say so.
Next question, is Skinwalker Ranch on ley lines?
Skinwalker Ranch, I don't believe actually is on the 33rd parallel. I don't think so, but don't quote me on that. But there is an interesting line of magnetic anomalies that start off the ranch's property, go through the ranch, and directly line up with this place on Space Wolf Research where that trailer was lifted and moved. There's a guy named James Keenan who has done a lot of research and an understanding of the magnetic anomaly underground. And he has documented this bizarre straight line that lines up with all this activity. In fact, on the Skinwalker Ranch, there's this triangle area that has a lot of weird things happening. That is a magnetic anomaly. And it's just interesting how this line just lines up. And what is this magnetic anomaly? We don't know. We don't know if there's some kind of underground base, that there's some kind of energy being generated. I tend to think it's probably more natural than human activity underground. But natural for me is still paranormal. So I think that there's some really weird things happening.
Which ties in nicely to the next question. Does any of this coincide with plutonium or uranium deposits?
Not that I've ever heard of. That's an interesting take. I've never looked into that aspect of things. From what I have understood is that this is a phenomenon that's happened for hundreds of years, well before any modern science technology tampered in the area. This is something that has been happening. And when you know about the Skinwalker angle of things and the ritual aspect of it, and then all the paranormal things that follow, it really kind of sets the tone that they're. So people say that magic is only science that we don't understand, and maybe that's true. But I think that in this case, then we're dealing with quote unquote science that we really don't understand still, and is still going on. I tend to wonder sometimes about this idea of it, and how is it possible that if a certain geographical area has a ton of, let's say, magic, science that's not understood happening in it over a long extended period of time, is there some kind of spiritual veil that can be thinned, and where these areas tend to have more access? I don't know, but it's just a thought that I think about a lot.
Have any ancient native bones been discovered on the stolen land? That's from Kaza.
Yeah, I think that that's something that happens quite often, and not only just bones, but giant bones. This is an area that the giants. There's tons of legends of giants roaming the land. We found ancient carvings while we were out there of what seemed to be giants. You got one character that's over twice the size of all the other characters in the carving, and that character has 6 fingers on each hand, which is a common thing that was described with these giants, that they had 6 fingers, red hair. And so it seems like the giant aspect has been plagued in that area. And so I think that there's been a lot of cover up when it comes to the giant bones that have been discovered all over the country here. I mean, all over the world, really. But I mean, I just talked to a guy a couple months ago that was part of an excavation and uncovered giant bones in Kentucky back in the 80s. So this is something that is nothing new for sure.
Question from Rebecca. Has Tony heard anything about certain frequencies of sound being used to lift and move heavy objects? One theory of how the stones for the pyramids were moved.
Yeah, I was just going to say that too, actually. I've heard that theory. And I think it's definitely something to consider. We are actually going on another film shoot in 2 weeks. We're shooting another documentary in a location called The Land Between the Lakes. And we're basically hunting this upright walking dogman creature that has been rumored to be in this area. Supposedly, researchers have documented up to possibly over 20 deaths that happened in this area that they believe came by the claws of a dogman. While we're out there, we're bringing a guy in who has invented a piece of machinery that he believes will do similar things like that through sound waves. But what our whole point in doing it is to see if it works. But he believes that if we run this frequency and long enough and powerful enough, that it actually might open a portal. And if we do that, well, I got guys that I'll throw in. I'm staying here though.
So looks like we've run out of time, Tony. There's tons of questions. We'd love to get you back at some point.
Absolutely.
Can you just let the viewers know again where they can find you and support you online?
Yeah, so I'm CEO of Merkel Media. You can find the website merkel.media. There's no .com. It's just merkel.media. You can find us there. The films are there. The podcast is The Confessionals. That's what got this all started, where I interview people on their paranormal experiences. And you can find that on any podcast playing app.
Well, huge thank you for spending time with us this evening, and have a great rest of your day, and look forward to hearing what you get up to next. Cheers, Tony.
Take care. Thanks.
Thank you. Cheers. Right, so we have the return of Stephen Knight. I'm going to bow out for my break, and we're going to hand over to Ash.
Hey, Ashton, how are you?
Hey, Stephen. Doing great. How are you?
Wonderful. Thank you very much for joining us. Really looking forward to getting into this topic, because it's, I think left field might be an understatement in terms of theories I've heard regarding this. So maybe before we get into that, you could just let people know who you are, what you do, what keeps you busy.
Yeah, my name is Ashton Forbes, and you can find me at Twitter, justxashton. I have a top secret government clearance as part of being a contractor. Can't go into more detail on that, but what I can say is that my job has nothing to do with UAPs, advanced research and technology. All the information that we're going to be talking about here is public domain and publicly available.
It's time travel, isn't it? That's what you're up to.
In this case, I don't necessarily think so, but it's actually not completely ruled out.
It's all relative, isn't it?
Yeah.
So tell us about the official stories surrounding MH370. I mean, what's the narrative that's out there? What's the general consensus? And then we can delve into what you think happened.
Yeah. So the general narrative out there is that this plane was the pilot was in charge of this plane, and that they flew it intentionally out into the South Indian Ocean, ran out of gas on it. That this was supposedly some sort of pilot suicide narrative, which doesn't really fit any of the facts. And that this plane crashed in the South Indian Ocean, where 9 years later, we haven't found any plane. That the official search that was the most expensive and most extensive in history did not find one piece of the plane. And that we found no debris field for a 777 crashing into the ocean, despite the fact that this was an active shipping route. And there was no witnesses that saw the plane in the South Indian Ocean either. So as you can tell, we're going to be picking that apart.
Okay, I was under the impression they did find some debris. Is that not correct?
So some debris did wash up. The official search did not find a single piece of the debris at all. The debris that washed up, only one piece has been conclusively connected using a serial number. And they don't tell you that they did not use a unique serial number to do that. The flaperon's unique serial plate was actually missing. And you can Google this and find out that this is actually real information. So with respect to the debris, it's been highly contested. But as we'll talk about here, it's not inconsistent with what we think we're seeing in the MH370 videos, which we have concluded to be a form of teleportation.
Okay, so I suppose just to get a baseline before we really get into the details of what you believe. I mean, I'll openly admit I know very little about the ocean in general, apart from it's massive. It is quite large and vast, and there's often that phrase or cliche thrown around that we know more about perhaps the surface of the moon than we do about the seabed, for instance. I don't know how much of that's true, but potentially, is it possible that a passenger airliner of that size and shape could land in the sea and be completely undiscoverable just solely given the vastness of the ocean?
No, it's not. And part of the reason why is that the official narrative has this plane running out of gas. So they searched everywhere where this plane feasibly could go. They searched all along the 7th arc, everywhere along the flight path where they presumed, based on the whisper route data, based on the pings, where this plane could be, and they found nothing, absolutely nothing. Again, this debris field from a 777 crashing into the ocean would be visible from space for days. And as we have found out, there are satellites everywhere that would have seen this. In a post 9/11 world, it's not feasible that the United States government was not tracking a rogue 777 that was flying for 8 hours, that they say. And as we'll find out, there's a lot of information that actually points this to being either a type of hijacking event or what I believe to be an emergency event related to a fire. And if it is a fire, there's no way that a plane is lasting for 8 hours. In fact, for it to even last as long as we believe, which is about an hour and a half, that's still pretty miraculous, honestly.
Okay, well, at this point, our trusty audience, if you have any questions about that flight, any theories that you want to put to Ashton, put them in the comments and I'll put the best ones to him before we wrap up. But Ashton, maybe you can just give us your working theory then. What do you think is the most likely explanation as to why this plane's not been found yet?
Yeah, right before I do that, I want to say that there was no acoustic detections from at least 3 different systems that would have heard the plane crash into the ocean. The Diego Garcia hydrophones, Western Australia hydrophones, and the SOSUS system, which is the one that heard the Titan sub pop while the Navy lied about it for 5 days and let there be oxygen counters on every major news station. All of these would have heard this plane crash. In addition to that, 19 family members signed a statement claiming that they could call the cell phones of the victims, which, despite experts going on TV and claiming that that can work, is not feasible. There's no cell phone service in the middle of the ocean. Your phone will die within several minutes of being in the salt water. And after it goes, I believe, 1 foot underneath the water, you'll no longer receive a signal. So there's a lot of evidence that this plane simply did not crash down there. My theory is that what really happened is at 1721, when this plane went dark, they ignited a lithium ion battery fire. This has been corroborated by over 10 witnesses that have previously been discarded, including Mike McKay, who was on the oil rig and saw the plane on fire. He did not see the plane crash by his own words. There was several witnesses that were along the coast that heard a loud bang at 1720, which is consistent with the time of this plane going dark. And then there was 2 fishermen who were right off the coast as well, that at 1730, less than 10 minutes after this event, they saw the plane flying so low that they thought it was unusual, which again is consistent. If there was some type of minor explosion and the plane had depressurized, the pilot would have needed to fly low enough to get oxygen to the plane so that the passengers would be able to breathe. And this would be under about 10,000 feet. Now, this plane turns and goes directly to Penang Langkawi International Airport, which, if you look up the Wired article about this, they actually assumed it might be a fire. And this would be the most logical place for them to try to go. The issue here at this point is that if the plane was damaged, it would not be able to land safely at Penang Langkawi International Airport. And then it proceeded to go to the Nicobar Islands after that. When it gets to the Nicobar Islands, we are presuming that at some point here, some radio communication had happened with the U.S. government that has been classified and not revealed to us. There was an encrypted communication that was intercepted and only reported in the Chinese news that claims that at 2:43 a.m., which if you convert that to Malaysian time would be 18:43 UTC, that the plane was attempting an emergency landing and disintegrating. There was a witness as well at the Nicobar Islands that everybody agrees was under the flight path, and she saw a glowing orange plane consistent with the direction of travel that we see in the MH370 videos. What we've come to conclude from that orange glowing plane is that would be the halon gas in the plane. That's the fire extinguishing gas that is causing a chemical reaction that broke containment and filled the plane with this gas. And what that would do then is cause the whole plane to glow orange. As we discovered that, then we realized that all of these pieces start to line up. Now, when you then go look at the videos here, what we then will be talking about is a situation where this may be them trying to save the passengers using some type of technology that was previously unknown to the public.
Which videos are you referencing specifically?
Yeah, so these MH370 videos have been on the internet since 2014. We have gone and looked at the Internet Archive to confirm these dates, and the very earliest footage comes from an account that's named Regicide Anon. This is a UFO video account. And on this account, their description of it says that it was received March 12th, 2014, just 4 days after the events of MH370. It was uploaded on May 19th, 2014. The source says protected. Now, when we look at this video, we can see that we are looking at stereoscopic 3D video from satellite. You can see that there's two scrunched together videos, and it looks unusual as though it was duplicated. Analysts have looked at it and been able to determine that this is actually two different cameras from different angles shooting down from space. There's not a lot of satellites that have this configuration. You can look up the amateur trajectories, which we have done, and we believe we confirmed that this is USA 229. It was looking at this point in the Nicobar Islands at exactly 1840 UTC. So this corroborates the events that we see in the videos with a satellite that is looking down on it, in addition to all the narrative that I just described.
So, so the working theory you have is a sort of cabin fire caused by a lithium battery. Why would that kind of thing be covered up then? If that's an explanation and it's a solid one, surely that would be public knowledge.
Yeah, that's exactly the rub, right? So first of all, if you look up these lithium-ion battery fires, a lot of planes had burnt up between 2010 and 2014 due to them. They were a huge risk. In 2015, the FAA changed the rules to no longer allow lithium-ion batteries in the cargo hold of passenger planes. In fact, if you go try to mail something in the United States, even a piece of paper, they ask you if you have any lithium-ion batteries in that because of the high risk of these events. They're very energetic batteries that are very difficult to put out, if not impossible. So the problem here is that if this plane was even trying to land in the ocean as an emergency landing, it would have broken apart upon trying to land in the ocean due to the waves. So why do you try to cover this up? You know, this is a very mundane thing. It shouldn't be something you would have to cover up and invent this fake story into going into the South Indian Ocean. And that's the exact explanation, is that the technology that we see being deployed is the reason why you're covering it up. In these videos, we're seeing not only superconductivity with these orbs that are seemingly defying gravity and ignoring gravity, we are also seeing a black hole, which we have confirmed to be teleportation via macroscopic decoherence. And what that essentially means is they've reversed the double slit experiment. The double slit experiment says we're going to shoot one photon through two slits and try to figure out which one it goes through. And when you try to measure that, the wave function breaks down. Macroscopic decoherence reverses that and says, instead of looking at a deterministic point, we're going to turn something into a wave function, where now we can't tell necessarily which slit it went through. But doing that at a macro scale to a 777 in 2014 is almost unconceivable technology. So this is the reason why they've hid this.
How have you managed to authenticate the authenticity of these videos? Is there any possible way you can do this?
Yeah, so the way that I went about to try to do that is to try to figure out who the person is that leaked this information. It clearly didn't come from this Regicide Anon account, since this is a random UFO account, and other people uploaded different versions of these that have higher quality. You can't make a higher quality video from a lower quality footage. And just to confirm that it's MH370, the Regicide Anon account, 3 days after they uploaded it, made an account on Twitter saying to look at this video before it's deleted, and they tagged MH370 in that. So I went and looked for everybody that had been charged with espionage, because I figured that whoever leaked this, the government would have come after them for trying to get this information to China or whatever else. And it took weeks until I found somebody that fit the mold. I looked up all the people that were, very prominently charged with espionage, classified information, etc., until I found Edward C. Lin, And it turned out Edward C. Lynn was part of an advanced squadron that had access to top secret information and black projects. He had worked significantly with signals intelligence, which is what we believe is relaying the information between these assets in order to create the video that we see, the 3D stereoscopic video. He was caught with flight manifests for a search and rescue operation, which there's not a lot of operations that were in the time period. He was arrested in September of 2015 after the FBI tried to run a sting operation on him to prove that he was committing espionage. They were not able to get any of those charges to stick. He ended up taking a plea deal where he made an apology that what he had released and leaked had, theoretically damaged the government, etc., and ended up getting 9 years in prison despite that. So they were trying to put him in prison for life, and that's what he was facing. If you go look at the charging document, almost everything is redacted, including the dates. I would estimate that if we were to see those dates, we would find that they would likely corroborate with our video leaks.
Okay, so just to back this up a little bit. So, if this is a conspiracy to cover up some form of emerging technology that was used at the time, I'm assuming perhaps you'd assume it was American technology. It seems to me that this would require a sort of multinational cooperation to keep this under wraps. We've already got Malaysian Airlines thrown into the mix. Airspace complicates things in terms of in an international sense, and obviously America's interest in this as well. So how would it be possible that all those kind of bodies could cooperate in such a way on a grand scale to execute this in that way?
Yeah, and that's why what we're looking at is the greatest conspiracy of all time, frankly, because what we're talking about here is an international cover-up. And it wasn't until I looked at Florence DeChangy's presentation where I realized that she had already figured out that something was really wrong. Some of the things that she mentioned was that the Chinese ambassador told the Chinese families, it's very complicated, you cannot understand, which she did not think is something you tell somebody if you significantly don't know what happened to the plane. The White House was calling every day, which doesn't make any sense because they wouldn't have directly been involved unless they were directly involved when they didn't say anything.
Were there any American citizens on board? Do you know?
Yeah, Philip Wood was an American citizen who was on board as well.
Would that not explain the interest from the White House, perhaps?
I don't think it would explain them calling every single day, but it could explain there being some interest. Also, Barack Obama, I believe, spent extensive time there, which was somewhat unusual right after the event as well. So the theory here is that they were developing a cover story. Now, if you go look at the official narratives, they actually changed weeks later, and they did not release the Immerstat pings or the radar information for weeks. The theory here is that they had to come up with this cover story, and I don't know if they had to necessarily falsify the information, but get the information to line up in a way where they could present the South Indian Ocean narrative. Interestingly enough, the South Indian Ocean turn is in the exact location of our videos. The last time, if you go look up when this plane was lost and look up the very earliest reports of the same night, the time that they claim that the plane was lost contact and communication was 1840 UTC. That's the exact time that we're talking about where this plane is being zapped by this black hole from this macroscopic decoherence. So what this indicates is that they ended changing the time and claiming that the radar data shows them losing it at 1822 UTC, but only weeks later after the event.
So, tell me about these orbs then, because you mentioned some orbs circling before that's shown in these videos. What do you think that represents?
So to be perfectly honest with you, right away, I had a hard time believing the videos. I had ontological shock. It was extremely difficult to believe that this could be real technology and that we could have it. So I went from believing that it couldn't be real to believing that this must be non-human intelligence that we're looking at because it's so unusual and consistent with a lot of UFOlogy patterns, black triangles, things like that. But the more I dug into it, especially the intent around the videos, how they're filmed, the fact that this MQ-1C Gray Eagle cannot catch a 777, ended up looking like this is an operation of some sort. And so therefore I came to the conclusion, especially after looking into the science and realizing that we can explain every aspect of these from the scientific perspective, that what we're looking at here is reverse engineered technology that's been kept secret from us, and that this is actually our technology. And that somehow, even in 2014, we had already cracked superconductivity. We had already cracked AI, which is probably a requirement in order to see the pattern that we're seeing there. It's not people or aliens flying around in these little orbs. Their pattern is too exact. What they're doing appears to be tracking the plane, potentially even scanning it to ensure that whatever they're about to do with this portal will fully encompass it. If you were to collapse time down upon itself while these orbs are spinning around it, you would notice that they're creating a sphere around the plane, which seems to be mapping the plane to prepare it for this portal effect. Now, lastly, right before the portal effect happens, if you watch it in super slow-mo, you can actually see the orbs converge on the plane. And as they converge on the plane, what we're presuming is happening here is that their superconductive properties are creating essentially free energy, infinite energy, enough to create the singularity that we see. So not only are we talking about teleportation being hidden and superconductivity being cracked 10 years ago, we're also talking about the potential for free energy being hidden as well.
Do you feel it's possible that there is a lot of conjecture here that relies solely on some video clips that, on the face of it, are unverified? I mean, if them video clips didn't exist, would this narrative fall apart?
Yeah, everything is based on the videos, because the reality of this is that we have deduced all this information simply from these videos. Now, the thing about the videos is they're on the Internet Archive. So they are out there and they cannot be denied at this point. But to the point of what I'm bringing is I'm not asking anyone to believe anything I'm saying. Everything that I'm presenting is verifiable evidence. The satellite in its location, verifiable. It's already been confirmed by Victor of the Independent Group and somebody on Metabunk as well. And that corroborates our time. We have the witness testimony that was posted in 2014 that was listed there as well. So everything that we've got out there can be cross-referenced, verified, including the science itself.
Okay. Has anyone, to your knowledge, tried to debunk these videos? Have they come up with an alternate explanation as to their origin? And if so, what are these explanations they've given, and why aren't they convincing to you?
So to date, no one can give a comprehensive explanation for where these videos would have come from, who would have hoaxed them, or anything about that. Most of the debunkers have given up because what they were doing was essentially authenticating the videos. They were trying to prove that the plane couldn't make this type of turn, and it turned out that it is making the exact maximum capabilities of a 777-200 while on descent, while turning in a circle. The only debunk that they try to use is a prosaic debunk to try to claim that the zap may come from some low quality two-dimensional VFX from the 90s, which simply does not match, is not the right color, and doesn't make any sense to use as a visual effect. Not only that, they wouldn't have any basis. The issue here is that when we're looking at the zap and the thermal, we're seeing it as a black dark hole, cold dark hole, black hole. All human explosions are hot and white, including the VFX that they tried to claim as part of this video. So if you were making these videos from scratch and there's no basis to kind of copy them from, then you wouldn't turn it black. You would simply use the VFX as already created and superimpose it over the videos. The video that someone would have created if they were hoaxing it would be a explosion, and that's what they would show us. There are other aspects too, that the orbs are actually showing the some sort of gravity engine. There are black lines in front of the orbs that are pulling these orbs forward. So they're showing these superconductive properties, but they're also showing what we would think of as a gravity engine, possibly a la Bob Lazar and what he had disclosed in the 90s. So all of this makes it extremely difficult to fake. In addition to the fact that you would have to have the knowledge of the military assets that are in play there. So keep in mind that we've proven that these footage is dated back to at least 4 days or up to 72 days after the event, if you assume that Regis Adnan was lying about when he or she received the footage. So if you take all of this stuff together and you talk to visual effects artists, they will tell you that while you might be able to theoretically make something in 2014, all of these requirements combined, in addition to the fact there's no visual discrepancies on any frame throughout the whole footage, makes it nearly impossible or extremely expensive and require a team of people. So you might come in then and say, well, could the government have made it themselves in some sort of PSY operation? The problem with that is they never promoted these videos. If anything, they're actually still trying to hide these videos to this date. And the beauty of these videos is that there's no explanation that makes sense from the PSYOP perspective. The reason for that is that this would only implicate the US government further, is that if you present this to the common person, they're just going to look at it and say, okay, yeah, I don't believe in aliens and I don't believe in this. Obviously, the government is lying about this. So it doesn't make any sense from the psychological operation perspective. And there's no comprehensive explanation for the debunkers about how and why this could have been created and who could have created it and who would have spent the time to do it. Anyone who had enough expertise to be able to create this would want to get credit for it.
So if I missed something here, please forgive me, but is the implication that you're making that this technology that you are believing is evidence on these videos is a product of a way of time travel, in a sense, that we've managed to come across this technology from the future, or that we have it now and that it bends time?
No. So the thing about time is that, as far as I know, you can only travel forward in the future, according to science. People are trying to now argue that maybe you can go back in
We're
time,
time
but
traveling right now, aren't we, Ashton?
yeah.
Second by second.
And so the secret, though, what I'm saying is, if the faster you go and the further you go, from your own frame of rate perspective, you may show up instantaneously at your destination, but you are going to show up in the future based on how far you've traveled at the speed of light. If you go 1,000 light years at the speed of light, you're going to show up 1,000 years in the future, despite the fact that for your frame of reference, you may show up instantly there. That's what I mean when I talk about future travel. So when we're talking about teleportation, there's several options where you could go. Another dimension, you might go to somewhere else in the universe. You might go to the future, as I just described as well. Or you might just go somewhere else on the planet and hide the plane somewhere.
Okay, so I see your globally interconnected conspiracy, and I raise you Julia Hubbard's question. She's asked, could it have been accidentally hit by a missile and covered up to avoid a diplomatic incident?
Yeah, so the issue with that's the same issue with the plane crashing into the ocean. No debris field found anywhere, right? So if it had been hit by a missile, there would have been a debris field everywhere, bodies everywhere, all this stuff floats. We didn't find any of this stuff. Now, several people tried to claim that they were looking at satellite footage and they found debris. They've searched everywhere. So you can say that I think that the government's colluding to cover things up is certainly possible. But now when you're also including all these search people that are looking throughout the ocean everywhere, these are random people that aren't necessarily affiliated to the government. And for them to somehow cover this all up, all the body parts, all the pieces, everything, again, the official search didn't find one single piece. So I think that conclusively rules out any scenario where it was hit by a missile. What I will say, though, is this event that happens at 1721 UTC, where it goes dark, could be some form of espionage in theory that caused this fire to begin and start. Right now, we don't really have any conclusive data on that.
What if in the future, maybe not in the near future, but they somehow recover the debris of this plane? Maybe there's some new technology that we use to scan and we can find it, and it's perfectly understandable as to why we couldn't find it at the time. Would you accept that then as an explanation that the plane did crash into the ocean?
Yeah, if we could find that, but I'm 100% sure that will not happen. They've been searching for 9 years. It'd be a different story if we were talking right now in 2015, right? Like a year after the event had happened. But this has been 9 years, and they keep trying to say that, though, we've got a new spot to look in, whatever. They're never going to find the plane in the South Indian Ocean because it didn't go there. But if they do come up with it, I'll take a look at that data, and we would definitely, reevaluate our hypotheses.
Sounds fair enough to me. Ray J has asked, does Ashton know who was on the plane? Passenger list, anyone special? Any people of interest on that plane?
Yeah, and that's another piece that corroborates everything together. So there were 20 Freescale semiconductor scientists that were on board this plane. So that's way too many people of the same company to be on the plane. I did a podcast with Chris of the Not So Deep podcast. He actually worked for the company in 2014. He said these were very important people that were on this plane. So if you now put everything together with what I just explained with the technology, it kind of makes sense that this company may have cracked superconductivity 10 years ago. They may have been in cooperation with the government. These people actually might have been related to the technology that we see on the videos. If not, then they were potentially high value people either for the government that they wanted to protect and save, or this was an espionage scenario where they're trying to prevent these people from going to China since this plane was going to Beijing. To me, money is not a big enough motive for taking the risk that we see on here. It has to be something bigger than that. But intellectual property, potential shadow war for the control of this technology is big enough, because whoever controls teleportation, superconductivity, free energy, that's going to be the country that controls the world.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people might look at this and think, well, sure, I mean, if the government does have this kind of technology, they would certainly have to cover it up, and they seemingly have done a good job of doing that. And it seemed like they would be extremely competent human beings if they could do that. But on the flip side of it, they were unable to prevent, a disgruntled employee releasing some videos onto the internet. So I mean, how do we balance that with this ultra secretive, very efficient, technologically advanced government or whatever, other power, and the fact that they can't stop some chap leaking some of their really, officially secret materials?
Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, it's a pretty sloppy cover up if I can tear it apart with just a Twitter account and Google search. So I would say that it's not nearly as comprehensive as you're claiming. But the other thing, too, is if you dig into the motive, even before I found Edward C. Lin, I had already figured out this person was not a spy. that this person was somebody who was probably an operator of one of these devices and had the same type of ontological shock that we had, and realized from an emotional perspective, they had an emotional reaction, and said that the world's never going to know about this. They're never going to tell the truth. So they decided they would be the person who would do that. That's why I think that the leaker, who I've dubbed Agent 370, is a hero, at least a hero of mine. So, and they did. They took care of him. They basically threw him in prison right away. They wouldn't let anybody speak to him. He was in jail during the whole trial. So then they made sure that he signed a plea deal where he most likely can never talk about the videos ever again. And they actually made him like apologize as well. So presumably he had this emotional reaction, and they said, okay, you know how much damage you just did to the country and how risky this technology would be to leak. So I think that everything is actually, fits together pretty nicely. And the more people that you try to include in this cover up, the riskier of this information leaking out is. And as we see from Florence DeChangy's investigation, it seems like quite a number of people knew that something was wrong for sure. I don't know if they knew the depths of what we're dealing with in the technology, but most likely they knew that the official narrative was nonsense.
Okay. Gene Thornton's got a question for you. Have you had any other or seen any other situations like this, or is this a single occurrence? It's a great question. So, I mean, has anything else caught your eye that you think maybe you could link it to this technology or what you've observed in these videos?
To be honest with you, I wasn't deep into either the UFO community or even the conspiracy communities before this. People have sent me a lot of different examples of things like this happening. I think probably the most prominent historical example might be the Philadelphia experiment, where a whole ship just disappeared off the face of the earth. I believe there was also another plane that had a similar incident, like Frederick, can't remember the last name, but there are other instances. There was also a video that's shared with me of Madrid, where there were 3 orbs kind of going near and circling the plane. So there are theoretically going to be other things that are similar. What I would say is that my motive in disclosing this information and making this publicly available is that it can validate a lot of other people's sightings, a lot of other videos that have been dismissed and discredited. And I think that's one of my primary motivations in general.
What do you think the chief purpose of this technology would be for a state or a government?
Well, really, whatever they want. I think the big issue is that once these types of technologies have been discovered, then at that point, it changes everything. And the real question here is, how dangerous is this technology? Everybody wants to think from the UFO disclosure perspective that it's all roses, right? Is that what we're going to get is green energy, that, everything will be great and beautiful. Now, as we see from nuclear energy and nuclear power, there's also cost that comes with it. Nuclear bombs, for example. From a free energy perspective, if you can give somebody a portable explosion device that can take out a whole city, just imagine what people who have ill intent, like terrorists, would be capable of. So to me, and from what I've heard from sources, the reason why this technology is being covered up is that they believe that society would potentially collapse. So you can look at it from the perspective of the planet being destroyed, or major destruction happening. The other perspective that you can look at it from the scientific perspective is that the most likely explanation for macroscopic decoherence is that we live in a simulation. And I think that they may be worried that people will stop respecting the sanctity of life itself, right? If you think that this is just a game that we're living in right now, that people may not respect life. And my response to that would be, life is important. What matters is our time on this planet, and that the people that we spend with. And so this should not change anything about disclosing this information. And to the people that are hiding it, what I would say is, we can handle this information.
All right, Ashton, I agree with that final sentiment about time, for sure. I've really enjoyed speaking to you. It's something I've never considered before or looked at. So thank you very much for coming on. Maybe you can just let people know where they can find out more about what you've got to say on this issue and other issues, perhaps.
Yeah. Right now, if you go to my Twitter account, that's the best place to find me, at JustXAshton. You can go through my highlights and you can follow the whole history of the investigation. I've written probably over 50 pieces on all various aspects and evidence related to the case. And you can get up to speed there, and there's more to come.
Awesome. Thanks, Ashton. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Take care. A lot to unpack there. I'll definitely need to check out these videos first chance I get and see what that's all about. Just bringing our next guest, Stephen. Welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Doing well, Stephen. Nice name. Nice to talk to you.
I was just about to compliment you on your strong sounding name from the Greek Stephanos, meaning
That's
crowned
right.
one.
That's
if I'm
exactly
not mistaken.
right.
Yeah, there you go. Maybe you can tell us what keeps you busy, Stephen. What are your general interests? What do you produce content on? What takes up most of your time?
Yeah, I mean, aside from family life and homeschooling the kids and things like that, the main thing when it comes to the UAP podcast. I've been doing that for about just over 2 years now. And what it really comes down to there is it all kind of came from a passion of what the heck is going on. Like, I just had this question in my mind that I couldn't escape of what's happening out there. All these stories from decades and decades, and even going back to, ancient times in Egypt and things of that nature. And it just always stuck with me. Like, how could these things connect over not only decades, but centuries? So I kind of just started looking into all these things and decided, you know what? Maybe other people are interested in it too. And I thought, why not start doing a podcast to see if anybody cares? And I'm happy to say that a lot of people care, and it's been a great ride so far this past couple of years.
Well, let's start there with the description. The term UAP, unidentified aerial phenomenon. If I'm not correct, I mean, formerly the most used term would be UFO, but it seems there's been somewhat a shift in credibility regarding UFO enthusiasts, investigators, people like that. It's no longer really seen as this sort of kooky fringe X-Files fan kind of thing, isn't it? It seems to have been given a lot more credibility, and I think that comes with the change of term as well, isn't it? People are talking about it more as like an academic pursuit now, whereas before they weren't.
Yeah, that's exactly right. If you mind, I'm just going to put my hat on here because I haven't been able to get a haircut and it's looking a little shabby, so I'm just going to put on my hat instead. But no, you're exactly right. That was one of the things that really kind of, two-pronged answer. What led me to the name of UAP was what you just said, actually, because it was kind of the government's way of legitimizing the discussion, to have the conversation out in the open without using the stigmatized term of UFO, right? We've heard that term so many times, and UFO kind of became synonymous with, tin hat conspiracy theorists and the farmer who says he swears the UFO took his cow, So to use the term UAP, it kind of made it legitimate in the discussions through Congress and through the Senate and things of that nature, and in office buildings, for people to say unidentified aerial phenomenon. And that's kind of also what led to the name of the podcast too. I thought, well, let me take the P and make it podcast. So unidentified alien podcast is kind of where all that kind of, got that marriage there. But you're right, just to have, congressional hearings and have, Congress people like Nancy Mace or Tim Burchett and people like that asking serious questions to witnesses like David Grush, who, have all these top secret clearances under oath in front of the world to see. It's something I never thought that I was going to see in my lifetime. Certainly not even 2 years ago when I first started the show. It's been incredible to watch how, like you said, the conversation has kind of taken a turn into the mainstream.
Yeah, and I suppose that just to play devil's advocate with that, a lot of people would say it's not necessarily an increase in credibility regarding sort of alien-related UAPs. It's more people sizing up the threat from foreign nations and their advanced technology. Some of the drone technology is getting rather scary now in various ways. We've already had instances of the Chinese balloons and things like that. Is it a case of maybe the government sees a foreign nation more of a threat in regards to UAPs rather than thinking extraterrestrials?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Someone like Ryan Graves actually spoke about that during the congressional hearing. Was that a couple months ago or so? He's a former pilot, military, U.S. military, and he's spoken about his main mission is to get this conversation out into the mainstream for military pilots like himself, who have seen these things up in the skies during training missions or just missions in general. As they're flying around, these UAPs are flying next to them or buzzing them or showing up on radar and disappearing. And this has been happening. This isn't, if within the past 5 or 10 years thing. This goes back to World War II. And they were called Foo Fighters at that point, which is kind of where, Dave Grohl and the guys got their name for the band. But at that point, Foo Fighters were the term for UAP or UFOs. And that was the term that American pilots used during the war when they were seeing these things then in the 40s. So this isn't a new thing. It's not a new phenomenon. They've been, whatever these things are, have been watching, observing, and making themselves known to pilots for a long time.
Well, I'll let you know where I am. I know you didn't ask, but I'll let you know.
No,
In terms of
please.
UFOs, I used to be a big UFO enthusiast. In my mid-teens, I was huge into the X-Files. That was everything to me. I loved the lore, I loved the mythology, everything about it. And as I've got older, I've become more skeptical. Some might say cynical. And I don't believe in I don't believe extraterrestrials have visited us. I'm perfectly open to the possibility, and I actually want to be wrong, and I love having these conversations because I find it fascinating. So I suppose my question to someone like you is, how do you make sure you maintain your objectivity when you're presented with maybe a video of someone's claims it to be a sighting or a bit of information here and there? How do you keep your grasp on what is verifiably true, given your your interest and your enthusiasm for UAPs?
Yeah, great question. When I first see a video, because I come across, I'm sure you do too, you come across a lot of different videos in social media, whether it's, Twitter/X or YouTube, whatever it might be, Reddit. My first reaction is that's not real. And which might sound funny coming from a guy like me who talks about this stuff all the time.
Stephen, sorry to interrupt. Do you mind just checking your microphone? It's just going a bit crackly. I don't know if it's something that's plugged in or perhaps.
Let's try that. Is that a little bit better? Maybe you just lost reception for a little bit.
Possibly. It might be my earphones. Maybe people in the chat are saying it's crackly too, so I think it might be your end.
Okay. Let me see if
we can still hear you. It's just I think
just a little crackly.
I think it's the CIA trying to interfere.
I'm telling you, probably haven't had this problem all show.
We can all we can all make out what you're saying. It's not a problem.
Okay. But no, I guess, just to kind of get back to that, my first reaction is that a lot of the stuff I see isn't real when it comes to videos that are posted online or things like that, just because unfortunately so much can be done nowadays with CGI. Anybody can fake a video. It has to go through a sniff test, if you will, right? How was this video taken? Where was it taken? Was this from a military drone, or was this from somebody's, cell phone? So when you have to look at some different variables, and there are variables that, I've been told from sources who have reached out to me, military sources who deal with, their job is to look at these videos, actually. And there have been some videos that have been told to me that are verifiable. They don't know what they are. And the famous one is from 2013 over, I believe it was Puerto Rico. And it's this, what they call it, like a split UFO, a UAP, if you will. And it kind of oscillates through the air. It's very strange, turns on its side, goes into the water, comes back up and splits into two. And that was caught by military drone. And they have no idea what it was to this day.
Is this footage available online?
It is, yeah. You can find that on YouTube. Pretty famous video. The name escapes me right now. It's not the gimbal. That's a different video, but it's maybe somebody in the chat will think of it before I can. But I think it was Puerto Rico 2013. It's pretty wild. I had an episode on it maybe last month or so, but it's one that a lot of like UFO enthusiasts look into and say, hey, explain this one away. And it could be, look, Stephen, it could absolutely be adversarial. Now, to be fair, I've asked that question to the same military sources that have, verified or unverified some of the videos that are out there to me personally. What I've been told by these people within the military ranks is that if we don't have it, they don't have it. They meaning China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, any of the U.S. adversaries. Essentially because, again, this isn't me saying, it's what I've been told. They steal it from us. They steal the information. They steal the technology from us. And so if basically, again, what I've been told is if it's not us, then who is it? Because it can't be them. It's interesting.
That gives me a little bit of, I suppose it's a comforting message that, foreign agents like China, Iran, Russia, people like that aren't so technologically advanced as to produce something like that. But perhaps maybe there might be a bit of ego in there. I mean, you look at the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, for instance, very secretive, very difficult to get information from them. I mean, could we truly know what they're cooking up in the depths of their military test bases?
Yeah, no, and that's something I thought of as well. And I've asked the question several times. I always say, are you sure? Like, are you sure they're not hiding something? Like, can we really be sure that there isn't something there? that we don't even know that they're working on. And I've been told multiple times that same answer, that because and here's the thing too, Stephen, they also have reverse engineering departments. Russia does, China does. There's different countries, even some of our allies have reverse engineering departments within the government, like, supposedly the US does, from everything that we've been told, that all the indications show, that they work on these things, that they work on these UAPs that have been downed accidentally or on purpose in some cases, with advanced weapons that are supposedly being used on these UFOs that come down. And so if that's the case, then they're trying to figure it out just like we are. And so it's when you kind of connect the dots, right? You can say it's otherworldly, but it also might be us at the same time. It could be both. So it's a weird one to look at.
What's the likelihood in your mind then, if a government, say the US, or a Western force, or an ally of the USA, had confirmed the existence of extraterrestrial life? What are the odds, do you think, that they make this public information? And if not, what would be the reasons for not doing so?
The optimist in me wants to say the odds are great. I don't think the odds are that good. I would say less than 10%. They actually disclose, what a lot of people think are the truth about this, which is that these things exist. And the reason being, and I'm not saying ever, right? Things can change. Maybe the game changes where it's advantageous to them to disclose these things. But the reason why they wouldn't, the reason why it's not advantageous, really, it just comes down to the old game of power and money. I mean, as you go as far back in world history as you want to, with any empire, with any, presidents or emperor or anybody, it's come down to power and money. And when it comes down to these, so-called secret programs, black sites, things like that, where these reverse engineering technologies are being held, whether that means Lockheed, their, secret division of Skunk Works, or, Raytheon, or any of these companies, they control a lot of stuff and they make a lot of money doing it. And so government contracts and things like that, that would be the reason why it doesn't come out, just to continue to have that upper hand of money and power.
Well, just in the 13 minutes or so we've been speaking, I can already tell that you're kind of very level-headed guy, and you want to be objective about your interest here. But as you know, this subject really does run the gamut, doesn't it? We have people who are kind of, I just want to find out what this is, and they're really interested in getting to the truth. And then there's the far end of the scale of people who will say, like, my uncle was probed by a little green man in a cornfield, kind of thing. I'm just wondering what are some of the craziest stories you've had in your investigations on this?
Oh man, some of the stuff out there is, and there's a reason why I do what I do when it comes to the podcast, where I present the stories and I say, you make up your own mind. That's always kind of been my thing. Here's the story, here's the details on it, make of it what you will. And some of those, I have to put an extra disclaimer of that on it. Especially, there was one story that comes to mind that I did an episode on. It was this woman, and I forget her name. I think I did this episode last year, so off the top of my head, I forget her name. But she was a British woman, and she said that she was abducted back in the 60s, I want to say. And she was taken by this human-looking alien, which, by the way, according to accounts, they all don't look like little green men. Some of them look like humans, from what some people say. And this was one of the human-looking aliens. Took her up on the ship, took her out into the galaxies, showed her the ship. It was like this, utopian society on this mothership, and they ended up forming this relationship and had an affair and had this alien love child. And I'm thinking, and as I'm writing the episode and hearing the clips and forming my own ideas and opinions, I'm just thinking, I don't know if I can go through with this one. Like, this is unbelievable. But gosh, I'll tell you, Stephen, she gives incredible detail. Like, when the way she told the story was like she was recounting, a child's birthday, like one of her kids' birthdays. So unless she was just a master storyteller, maybe she's a descendant of Tolkien and she's just a master storyteller or something, or psychosis took over, or something really happened. It's fascinating.
It's a very complicated alimony dispute for sure.
Yeah.
isn't it? I mean, do you feel, I mean, in terms of these personal anecdotal experiences of abductions and things like that, people have often leaned towards sort of sleep paralysis to explain a lot of this. I'm someone who's experiences sleep paralysis quite often, actually, several times a year. It's horrible, quite terrifying. I don't know if you've had any experiences with it, but there's always this strange feeling of a presence in the room. And you often visualize this presence. Often could be a shadow, could be humanoid, but you're overwhelmed by the feeling that somebody is approaching you to do harm, and that's kind of intensified by the fact that you can't move. And a lot of UFO abduction stories often follow this mold. And I'm just wondering where that line is between what the power of the brain's capable of producing experience-wise versus, you know, a literal intervention from an extraterrestrial.
Yeah, it's really an interesting topic because I actually do get sleep paralysis as well. I don't, fortunately, I don't have it where, you know, I feel like there's another presence in the room with me, thankfully, because it's bad enough as it is. You're laying there and you can't move and you're trying to call out for help and nobody can hear you because you can't talk.
Yeah.
It's no fun. So I've never had it to the point where I felt like I'm being abducted or anything like that. But what I find interesting about the abduction cases relating to sleep paralysis, the idea, the notion of hypnosis and kind of having that, you know, you're able to revert back through hypnosis and backtrack what happened to you. And a lot of people who have been, you know, in these abduction cases, people who say they've been abducted, they've gone through this regression therapy, so to speak. And they're through that regression, they're able to give detailed accounts, terrifying accounts sometimes, because what happens is these memories are buried deep within their brains in the center where you would bury a traumatic memory, essentially. And that comes out during these regression therapies. And a lot of times they end up crying. A lot of times they end up screaming in terror or in pain during these regression therapies. But they're able to give details of what's happening to them. You know, they're laying on a bed. There's these beings around them. They're being experimented on. And these are people from the 70s, the 80s, the 90s to now who have no relation, different countries, different families, different walks of life, rich, poor, anything. And when they go through these regression therapies, they're able to recount similar details. And it's just, so could that, some of that be suggestive? Maybe, but that's another one of those things that's hard for me to explain. There's even a doctor, I believe his name was Roger Lear, I want to say his name is. He was a podiatrist. He was just a normal guy checking out feet, and he got interested in this subject and actually became known as the alien abduction doctor, and started to do surgeries on people who said that they had things implanted in them during abductions. And I kid you not, Stephen, they found, you know, materials and people's feet and under their thumbs, in between, like, you know, the folds of skin between the index finger and the thumb. They would find these little pieces of metal, and they don't know how they got there.
Well, I mean, something caught my eye several weeks ago, and I'm sure you've looked into this deeply too. But I was very surprised to see it, because usually when it comes to first contact stories, you know, it's very America centric, you know, and all the movies, they always seem to make contact with the White House first, for instance. But it turns out no. It turns out the Mexicans have pipped you to the post with, you know, public disclosure of extraterrestrial bodies. Pictures of these were released online. I saw them. My initial reaction wasn't particularly compelling.
Yeah.
What did you think when you saw these, like, humanoid miniature extraterrestrial entities that certain Mexican officials rather were claiming were proof of aliens?
I got to tell you, I'm with you. I didn't believe it at all. And again, that's the funny thing about me. You know, a lot of people think that I just hook, line, and sinker on this stuff. And I'm actually very skeptical when it comes to a lot of these things. But until I spoke to Robert Salas. Now, for anybody who's not familiar with Robert Salas, he worked at Malmstrom Air Force Base here in the U.S. And Malmstrom Air Force Base, basically in the 60s, was used, you know, the housing nuclear missiles. A lot of command was done there, you know, watching to see a lot of Cold War stuff, right? Making sure Russia wasn't firing nuclear missiles at us and ready at a stand, you know, on standby to fire back. Robert Salas was that guy. And there was a famous case in the 60s where these UFOs flew over Malmstrom Air Force Base and completely shut it down. Any capability that they had to shoot off nuclear missiles was frozen. The base was shut down for a day or so. And Robert Salas was there to witness all this, and he's written books about it and testified about it, had, gone into skiffs with these top secret, debriefings. And I spoke to him a few weeks ago about those mummies, so to speak, because he was called to testify at that Mexican congressional hearing. He was in the room when those mummies were revealed. And I asked him, what was it like? He's like, no one knew it was going to happen. He's like, I didn't know. None of the other witnesses knew those things were coming out. But when he told me what he told me on that episode, which was these things have actually been verified skeletons. These have been verified by surgeons, independent surgeons within the United States and around the world, where they've sent them to the UK, to Brazil, I believe, and other places around the world to do studies on these things. They have not been put together. They're not makeshift bones with animal bones put together with human bones or anything like that have been alleged. There's something. They are verifiable skeletons through CT scan, X-ray, and DNA testing. They opened them up and found cartilage and arteries. Like, this stuff is insane. So now the question is, since these are some type of beings, what are they? Were they deformed humans? I don't know, but there's something.
I need to check in on that and see where we are with the various investigations. The last I saw of it, I think you just covered it there, but there were some accusations of potential shenanigans with graves and things like that. So, I mean, I don't know how much of that was verified, but I need to look into it. But, I mean, I suppose a lot of people come into this kind of thing because they themselves have had an experience that they can't quite explain that's really had a big impact on them. And I'm just wondering, does that apply to you in any way?
Funny enough, I've never really had a true experience with sight. There was one thing that happened, my first true sighting, and this was last December. So the first time I ever had a sighting was last year, and it was, kind of reminiscent of what some people talk about with, strange lights that fly over. I had, I live near, within a flight pattern of the airport down here in South Florida. So I know the flight patterns of how these planes come over. I see it every single day. What was flying over, I still can't explain. They were going south to east and west to east and vice versa, back and forth. And there were 8 of them. They weren't Starlink satellites, because I checked into that. So that's the only sighting I've ever had, was just these kind of unidentified lights that I couldn't explain. They weren't blinking. They were solid orb, looking lights that flew through the sky at a steady pace, in like 5-minute intervals for about 30 minutes. It was very strange. But before that, I had never experienced anything that made me say, well, let me look into this. It was just always, I got interested in the stories. A lot of documentaries, a lot of TV shows. And I guess I'm just, a naturally curious person with a lot of questions. And a lot of the stories piqued my interest. One of the stories that really got me interested a long time ago was Rendlesham Forest in the UK, in England. It was a famous story that happened around Christmas time back in the early 80s. With 2 American soldiers, they came across a triangle UFO that landed in the clearing by the base there, and everybody thought they were crazy. And then their commanding officer went out the next night, and he's like, "Oh my gosh, like, something's here." And there's a recording of him saying this, because he wanted to go out there and record what was happening. And it's a very interesting case. I think it's Jim Pennington and John Burroughs were the 2 guys who experienced that. So if you never got to look into Rendlesham Forest, that was actually the first episode I ever did on UAP, because that's one of the things that really got me interested in this case. When you have really credible people, like soldiers, military men, who can come out and say, yeah, this happened, and I had to risk my career to even talk about it.
What would be a satisfying thing then on your bucket list in this regard? I think, like for me, I mean, I'm not aiming big. I'm not necessarily looking for, you know, little green men or First Contact or something like the movie Arrival. I think I'd be quite blown away and satisfied with, say, you know, a manned mission to Mars where they find a fossilized microbe or something like that. I think that would blow my mind in terms of, you know, evolutionary biology and the, you know, life itself. I mean, what kind of thing would be really satisfying for you?
Boy, I gotta tell you, I'm a little bit more grandiose, I think. What would be huge for me is for them to say we have craft, for the government to actually come out and say we do have craft that have landed here, and that we are working on doing reverse technology experiments. You know, and that's where you got different laser technology or radar technology, or that's how we made the iPhone, you know, different things like that.
Well, I suppose Roswell's the greatest example, isn't it, of where people would say that's already happened. And I'm just wondering, how does the Roswell narrative stand up to your scrutiny? Is that something you find credible, or do you kind of accept perhaps that it was a weather balloon, which is the official narrative?
The reason why I believe Roswell was actually an alien craft was because, again, you know, military type of testimony. There's people that have come across who worked in the military at some of these bases around that time, late 40s through the 50s. And they have said, you know, not like deathbed confession, but old men who just don't care anymore, who are ready to talk about what they've seen. And they've talked about going into these warehouses and saying, yeah, you know, I've been in the warehouses where the wreckage of these craft were, and it fills up the warehouse, and it's these big pieces of metal, but I'm able to go up to it and pick it up with my finger. Like what is that, right? I mean, if it looks like a big piece of metal, it's just, you know, a sheet of steel, but you can put your finger under it and pick it up, and it's as light as a feather. That's the type of stuff that makes me feel like maybe Roswell did happen, and it could have been the beginning of, you know, the secrecy, the reverse engineering technology, where we end up getting the SR-71 Blackbird. The U.S. had the SR-71 Blackbird back in, I think, the 60s or 70s. That thing was done by Skunk Works, the secret division of Lockheed Martin. We didn't even know about it until 20 years after it was created. Even going back, you know, there's so much stuff that's out there, that this technology that we have, that we didn't even know about. You go back to, you know, the raid of Osama bin Laden. We have a stealth helicopter. Like, when did that happen? You know,
that technology was so advanced. I think they actually downed one of the helicopters in the compound by accident, didn't they? And had to destroy it with explosives so that technology wouldn't fall into the hands of, you know, the Pakistanis.
exactly.
Yeah.
So
That's
it's the kind of stuff that just makes you wonder, you know, how much do we have? Where did it come from? And how much of it, what we're seeing in the sky, is ours versus theirs?
It's fascinating. I mean, and just lastly, if you can summarize this in 2 minutes or so, I mean, do you feel that, firstly, do you feel that extraterrestrials have visited this planet? If so, is it a case of they've arrived and they've gone, or do you think there are, you know, governments or agencies or states that actually have a working relationship with these extraterrestrial life forms?
Gosh, it's a great question. You've challenged me to
Just
answer
giving
that
you
in
a
2
minute,
minutes.
just a minute to sort that
Yeah.
out. Good luck, Stephen.
No problem. I'll point real quick. I do think, yes, they have visited. I do think that there is some type of cooperation, just my personal opinion on it. And I point to one story real quick with Dwight Eisenhower. Any enthusiast will know what I'm talking about when I mention Dwight Eisenhower, supposed meeting that he had with what was called the Nordic aliens, who look more like Chris Hemsworth, you know, with look, you know, human looking, big, tall, long blonde hair. And also had a meeting with the Greys. And this took place in California in the 50s, to basically come to a deal to say, we get your technology. If we let you do this, here's XYZ, sign on the dotted line, and we can work together. That's been a story that's been about, you know, for decades now. And Eisenhower's, I think it's niece or grandniece, has done interviews about this, and said that it's basically known through their family that that actually happened. So I do believe that there is some type of cooperation. Maybe that got out of hand at some point, and we don't know how to handle it anymore. But there's there's something going on behind the scenes, man, and I'm gonna keep going until I can figure some things out.
Well, Stephen, I've loved speaking to you. This has been great fun and really fascinating as well. Maybe you can just tell people where they can find the UAP podcast and anything else you're working on.
Yeah, sure. Anywhere, any major podcasting platform, Spotify, Apple, Amazon, you can find UAP. Just search UAP or UAP podcast. You'll see it come up. YouTube, TikTok, Twitter at UA Podcast 850. You see there on the bottom. I put a lot of stuff on there as well. I put snippets of the show, things like that. And I just gonna keep doing my best. So see what else comes up over time. And I appreciate the time, Steve. And I've really enjoyed talking to you as well. Thanks for having me today.
My pleasure. All the best, Stephen. Take care. Thanks for speaking to me.
All right. Thank you.
Thoroughly nice chap. It's basically standard when it comes to Stevens, and it's just the way it is. I'm going to bring in our next guest, who I'm sure, even though he's not a Stephen, it's a lovely man himself. Hey, John, how are you doing?
Good, Steve. Thanks for having me on.
My pleasure, entirely. Maybe you could just tell our viewers and listeners what it is you do, what keeps you busy.
Sure. Well, I work as a psychotherapist for my day job, and on the side, I write books and films. And I've been lucky to get my books published by other publishers, Trine Day Press and by Microcosm Publishing. And the first book was Drugs as Weapons Against Us, the CIA War on Musicians and Activists. And the second book was the FBI War on Tupac Shakur, State Repression of Black Leaders. And so I decided to turn those books into films and then produce a third film myself. And so, yeah, that's basically what, and Drugs as Weapons is largely about Tupac Shakur and the Black Panthers. And of course, the FBI War on Tupac Shakur is mostly about the Tupac Shakur, the Black Panthers, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and others.
This is great, and I'm really looking forward to speaking about this with you, because it's going to be an education for me. I don't know if you know this, John. It's not immediately clear, given my charismatic demeanor, but I'm not cool enough to be a Tupac fan. I'm not well versed in the old hippity hop, unfortunately, but I am aware of his death as well. His murder, rather. It's become, legend. It's become the focus of many conspiracy theories over the year, and we've had some, massive developments on this in the last few months as well. So I mean, maybe you could just for those people who don't know, give us a brief primer of who Tupac was.
Sure.
And what's the official story the night of his killing in Vegas.
Sure. So, well, he was born into a family of Black Panther leaders. His mother, Fannie Shakur, was one-time leader of the Harlem Black Panthers. His biological father was a New Jersey Black Panther, and his stepfather, Matulu Shakur, was an acupuncturist who started acupuncture for drug detoxing, and in the Bronx, and it was incredible. It was a great new development for addictions in the country, and he helped spread that use of acupuncture for addictions throughout the country. He also was a co-founding member of the Republic of New Africa, which was founded at Aretha Franklin's father's church in Detroit. It brought together organizers from all over the country, and that group was in solidarity with the Black Panthers, and just had different strategies and tactics, but was similar to the Black Panthers in other ways in their goals. And so he just came from this radical leftist family that and so when he was growing up, he was an intellectual. His mother made him read, punished him by making him read the New York Times cover to cover. When by the time he was 16, 17 years old, actually he was 17 years old when he was the youngest elected leader of a new group called the New African Panthers. And that group was trying to replicate the Black Panthers. And this was in the late 1980s. And so he was already a national Black leader before he became a rapper. He was already an activist. And so a FBI whistleblower named Wes Swearingen wrote a memoir about being part of the group called the Counterintelligence Program that murderously targeted the Black Panthers. And he said that when activists, raided an FBI office and stole all the files and exposed the FBI's counterintelligence program and their war on leftists in general, anti-war activists, as well as, black civil rights activists like the Panthers, they were forced to close it down. But they continued under the same thing under different names. And so, and he said that the COINTELPRO, they call it, counterintelligence program, for short they call it COINTELPRO. COINTELPRO continued at least until the mid-1990s, he said. And that's when, of course, Tupac was murdered or assassinated, you could say. So Tupac only at some point after around the time of his first album, he decided with his imprisoned activist stepfather, Mutulu Shakur, to kind of change tactics and pretend to be a gangster in order to appeal to gangs and politicize them. Because really he was an intellectual who rewrote Shakespeare into modern language, starred in it, produced it in high school, just a brilliant young man. And so that's why he could write so many songs so easily and, put out the loads of albums worth of materials before he died at the age of 25. And also publish a book of poetry and star in 6 movies and, just write so much, write a screenplay, etc. So by the time he broke into activism, he was targeted. I show in my books and films that he was targeted by the police, at least murderously targeted at least 3 times before he was actually murdered. And so he had this thug life plan, and that's what they called it, to pretend to be a gangster in order to appeal to gangs and politicize them. And this was part of his extended Black Panther family's plan that was succeeding in getting the Bloods and the Crips gangs in Los Angeles to call peace truces and stop fighting for drug turf and fighting each other and starting to fight racism in general and fight, and turn on to activism. And so that was spreading throughout California and then spread throughout the country with the help of other activists. A number of Black activists were involved in that spread, including like Harry Belafonte and others. But Tupac was key to that because he would hold gang peace truce picnics and different other events and get these Bloods and Crips leaders to call peace truces. And because he was beloved by the younger generation for his rap and his acting in films, etc. And so that was the hidden kind of Tupac that people don't know as much about. But I talked to his business manager, Watani Tayahimba, who was a longtime mentor, a former Black Panther from Los Angeles. And I talked to his national lawyer, Chokwe Lumumba, who was head of a group called the New African Peoples Organization. And others, close to Tupac to get this information. And so, at the time of his death, he had tried to sober up. He tried to get away from weed and alcohol and was engaged to be married to Kidada Jones, Quincy Jones's daughter. Death Row Records, his record label, though, was highly suspect. And he was trying to leave Death Row Records and start his own his own record label, but his own film production company, etc. He'd already started them actually. And but before he could leave, they held an event. They held a party before a Mike Tyson fight in Las Vegas. They got him drunk and stoned, and he didn't want to do that, but he ended up succumbing to the environment of the party, got drunk and stoned, and that way they were more easy. It was more easily to manipulate him when a guy they came upon a guy in a hotel lobby right after the Mike Tyson fight, who someone said, "Oh, he snatched a necklace off my neck and threatened me." And so he got Tupac to get involved in a little scuffle with this guy named Orlando Anderson. Filmmaker Nick Broomfield said that he thinks that Orlando Anderson, from all his investigation in his film Biggie and Tupac, he thinks Orlando Anderson was not a gang member, but was just paid a lot of money to take a beating in that hotel lobby. And then after that, he didn't press any charges. He didn't do anything about it. He acted like he wasn't fazed at all. But he did come into a lot of money right after that scuffle. And so so that happened. And then later, of course, Tupac was shot in Las Vegas in a drive-by shooting that the leading police investigator, Russell Poole, said was done by professional hitmen. And they must have used, he thought they used police radios because it was such a professional hit. And he says he came out and he told Nick Broomfield that he believes his fellow officers killed Tupac Shakur in order because, and he didn't know why, but he knew that he thought they did. And they ended up killing Biggie Smalls in order to cover up their murder of Tupac. And so he had investigated this for a while. And when he found dozens of his fellow police officers at all level of death row records, he went to his superiors and he said, "What are they doing there?" And superiors thought that they can trust him because he was a white high-level police detective. And they said, well, you can call them troubleshooters or covert agents, were their exact words. And covert agents, of course, means that U.S. intelligence were involved. And so highly likely that U.S. intelligence, murdered Tupac or assassinated Tupac because of his activism. Because his is getting the Bloods and Crips to call peace truces and turn on to activism also got them away, many gang members away from drug dealing, and that affected millions, if not billions, of dollars of the drug traffickers' money, because they're the street level drug dealers, the gangs, and so that was a major problem with his activism besides just his New African Panther leadership.
Okay, well, there's a lot there to unpack, and I really want to get into the specifics of who you thought murdered him. But I mean, you said something really interesting at the start of the conversation that I wasn't familiar with, and this is this idea that there had already been 3 violent attempts on his life by the police.
At least 3, yeah.
And can you describe those? Do you have them in your head?
Yeah,
what
sure.
happened?
Yeah. Well, the first one was when he first came out with a solo, album with a major label, and it was his political song "Trapped" started getting played on MTV worldwide, and within 3 days of it coming out, police stopped him supposedly for jaywalking, but they proceeded to choke him unconscious and smash his head against a curb. And I showed articles in my film and told about my book about people dying in police custody from that. And then there was police watching passively as strangers punched Tupac for no reason when he was an honorary guest at the 50th anniversary of the Marin Fest, a big music fest and neighborhood festival, and then shot at him in front of the police. And the police didn't arrest the people that shot at Tupac for no reason. They merely arrested Tupac and his brother, Mopreme Shakur. And then there was a incident in Atlanta where allegedly off-duty police officers, 2 brothers, 2 white Atlanta police officers, rushed over to Tupac's car right after he was leaving a concert, smashed his window, shot at him for no reason. Tupac merely rolled out the back of his car, grabbed a security guard's gun, and shot back in self-defense. Now that started to go into the courtroom, when it was found out that these police officers were carrying a gun that they stole from an evidence locker to shoot at Tupac. They stopped that court hearing, and it didn't even go to trial. So Tupac was let off completely because it was a botched, I argue, because it was a botched assassination attempt. Then there was a situation where Tupac was shot and in a recording studio lobby in New York City right at the end of a trial. And he went down to the ground, and then he was shot twice in the back of the skull, and the bullets came out the front of his skull, according to the doctor's affidavit, which I have. And showed in the first version of my book. I showed it in my film, and that was another assassination attempt. And the same police, basically police showed up immediately at the scene. The kind of supposed mugging happened in the lightest area. It happened at 11 p.m. at night in the brightest area of the world. It was Times Square, New York City. That's where that recording studio was. And so, of course, then the final murder was in Las Vegas with a supposed drive-by shooting. And of course, and so they shot Tupac, and right behind Tupac, where the bullets were coming from, was Suge Knight, and they didn't hit Suge Knight at all. Now, there was a recent arrest, though, was of a guy who said, well, I was in the car where the bullets came from. It was my nephew, Orlando Anderson, the guy that took the beating and, was involved in the scuffle in the hotel lobby. He's the one that pulled the trigger. So this guy, Dwayne Keefe D. Davis, says this. He's arrested just within the past month or so. But he had said this about 8 or 10 years ago for a guy named Greg Kading, a police officer. Now, Russell Poole, who I told you was the original investigating police officer, he said Greg Kading was brought out about 10 years after his investigation to basically discredit his investigation, because when Russell Poole tried to come out with the fact that he found his fellow police officers were involved in Tupac Shakur's murder, they demoted him, and then they silenced him, and he had to resign from the police force to come out with his findings, which Nick Broomfield covered in his documentaries, and veteran reporter Nick Randall Sullivan covered in a book called Labyrinth. And so Russell Poole ends up saying that Greg Kading was a disgraced police officer brought out, who was caught lying in court, forced to resign early, and they brought him out of retirement in order to just cover up his own findings. And that Greg Kading never talked to Russell Poole at all. And Greg Kading said it was this Dwayne Keefe D. Davis drove the car, was the mastermind of the murder of Tupac. His nephew actually pulled the trigger. And meanwhile, it was found out that Dwayne, Keefe D. Davis was given, was supposed to go on trial and was supposed to receive a life in prison for drug dealing. But when he gave this confession of being behind Tupac's murder, he was completely let off the drug deal that could have landed him in prison for life, the drug dealing charge. And he was never prosecuted for the murder of Tupac either for years. We're talking about for about 8 or 10 years. And so he obviously gave a confession just to get out of going to prison for drug dealing. And it was also found that this Greg Kading was caught lying when he said that some of the most corrupt police that were convicted of all kinds of corruption charges, they were actually working for Death Row Records. He said they were never working for Death Row Records, and his police chief said they were. They were certainly working for Death Row Records. So this is some of the evidence that is, this is a bogus arrest charge of who's the guy who's supposed to be involved in Tupac's murder, and that's where we're at.
All right. Well, there's obviously very detailed answer there, John. So thank you for that. But if anyone's got any questions for John about the murder of Tupac, any wild conspiracy theories that you want clearing up, put them in the chat, and I will pick out the best ones. So, John, it seems that you lean in the camp of Tupac was considered maybe a threat to the status quo, or the state in general, because of his activism and his work, and it became necessary, to take that piece off the board, to put it bluntly. And I mean, it's certainly possible as well, but I suppose given his prominence, his wealth, his infamy, the fact that he was vocal about gangs and things like that, could that legitimately have just produced a kind of heat that would have made something like this inevitable anyway?
Yeah, no, I don't think it would have been inevitable for police to be involved in so many attacks on him just randomly, because there were so many attacks that were completely covered up. And so it takes, there was a undercover agent involved in setting up a sexual assault charge on Tupac also. This guy was found to have dozens and dozens of, major charges all dismissed, which top lawyers said was a sure sign of a government intelligence agent. It's the only kind of person that can get major charges up and down the East Coast dismissed. And this is a guy named Haitian Jacques Agnon. And so Tupac, ended up realizing he was an undercover agent, and said he was working for the feds in a song of his, a rap of his. And he said he set me up and wet me up because he thinks he was involved in setting up one of the shootings of him, and then setting up the sexual assault charge that he was eventually actually found not guilty of all major charges except touching a woman's butt against her will, who had admitted that she had consensual sex with him, and he got 1.5 to 4.5 years in jail for touching a woman's butt they had consensual sex. And so it's, these bizarre kind of charges and other, actions that show, government involvement, much more than just random and like random heat. I have loads of details, over 1,000 endnotes in my books about, from all the evidence, including government documents, court documents, some FBI documents, etc., that just, show the evidence of everything I'm saying here.
Okay. In regards to Dwayne Davis, then, I mean, why has it taken so long to arrest this chap? I mean, have they arrested him solely on the strength of a confession, like you said earlier, or are there other bits of evidence that they finally pieced together to be able to charge him?
Yeah, well, I think it's. I mean, he said outright that he was involved. He was in the car that driving his nephew, who he says killed Tupac. Then he also said, though, in an interview, that his nephew went to the emergency room after the scuffle in the hotel room. I mean, the hotel lobby where it happened, and within 2 hours of supposedly going to the emergency room, he then is in a car, and he says, and he had his arm in a sling. His right arm was in a sling, he said, and so he's supposed to have a right arm in a sling, and then supposedly, is a perfect, shooter to kill Tupac in a drive-by shooting. And so it's just his statements are full of ridiculous, contradictions. They don't hold any weight because there's no physical evidence backing what he said. He said that Puffy, another major producer and rapper now called P. Diddy, I gave him $1 billion to carry out this hit, and that's another fantastical statement. That's just supported by very little evidence. And most people don't believe that. And so, no, I don't believe that P. Diddy had a hand in both Tupac and Biggie's deaths. I think P. Diddy wasn't political, and that was a big difference. But when P. Diddy started getting political a couple of years later by getting involved in a group called the Hip Hop Summit Action Network, P. Diddy got targeted himself. A government informant shot at P. Diddy for no reason. One of P. Diddy's rappers, Shaun, on his label, shot back in self-defense. Shaun went to prison for that. They tried to pin a gun possession charge on P. Diddy. When I was in living in New York City, the local news said that the government spent the most money ever on a gun possession charge to try to gain evidence on P. Diddy, and they couldn't, find the evidence to support that he was just, should be found guilty for gun possession. And so he didn't go to jail, but there was obvious warning to him to stop getting active in politics, get out of the Hip Hop Summit Action Network. Because most of the rappers that got involved in Hip Hop Summit Action Network, some of which just weren't political before that, most of them were targeted in various ways. So this goes beyond just targeting Tupac.
Kazabez followed up with, there were 4 of them in the car. Do you happen to know if this is correct? And if so, who are we missing here?
Yeah, well, I argue that this whole theme, this whole idea that these gangbangers in the car pulled off the assassination of Tupac Shakur is all illegitimate. Russell Poole said it was professional hitmen. Likely, he says his fellow police officers were likely in the car. If not, then they had professional covert agents that did this for U.S. Basically, he said they were professional hitmen that did this. And he said gangbangers could not have pulled this off. It takes police radios. It takes all kinds of sophistication.
Sorry to interrupt, John. I mean, what would be so complicated about pulling up alongside a car and spraying some bullets? Because I mean, from the sort of reports of the autopsy reports, things like that, I think he took a few bullets in the legs and things like that, and 2 in the chest. It seemed like it was a kind of very sporadic popping off. I'm not a gun expert, you might imagine.
Yeah, well, Russell Poole was a high level police detective in Los Angeles, who studied loads of these kinds of situations, and so I just take his word about the fact of the way it was needed to be pulled off. Biggie Smalls, FBI file even talked about this, and other police officers who were investigating also agreed that they believed it was a professional hit. But nonetheless, it's also the fact that the Las Vegas Police Department, according to award-winning Las Vegas police reporter Kathy Scott, she said that Las Vegas Police Department went against all of their normal procedures for investigating the situation, and they completely let off these people that killed Tupac. And so why did they do that? And why did they help cover it up? Russell Poole said he talked to the lead investigator in Las Vegas, and he joked that, well, we got a closet full of evidence, but no one's ever going to see it. And so he said they were covering it up, and he didn't know why. Russell Poole didn't know why. And Kathy Scott also said that an FBI agent was in Tupac's motorcade when he was killed, and was surveilling the situation. Why? So these are all loads of more evidence that this was a U.S. intelligence operation. It was not a random shooting, and not a random murder of Tupac. It was an assassination of a highly influential activist young man who was incredibly talented too, obviously.
I mean, maybe just take a moment to explain why he posed such a threat, because a lot of people won't be familiar with his activist background. A lot of people would have seen him as just a highly successful musician. Why would it become necessary? How would they benefit from removing Tupac from the playing field? Again,
so when he was getting gang members, like for example, the Latin Kings were like the biggest gang in New York City. They were a Latino gang, and they were influenced by the Young Lords, who were close with the Black Panthers. They were influenced by former Young Lords to follow in this movement, this gang peace truce movement, and turn into activism. And they gave up all drug dealing. And when they were arrested en masse at one point around 1995 or I believe it was around 1996 or 7, there were no drugs found on them. Okay, and so when you take 3,000 members of a gang who were all mostly drug dealing, and you take all those drugs off the street, and this is just one gang of many throughout the country that were drug dealing, that money was being laundered in the banks. And the United Nations analysts have talked about this, that hundreds of billions of dollars have been found to be laundered in many major banks. HSBC, which in Britain, JP Morgan Chase, etc. They've admitted to it. Loads of money are laundered, and that laundered money, it's a huge cost when it's taken off the streets, when you're not laundering that money anymore. The CIA has been caught drug trafficking in a major way. 60 Minutes, our national program that has covered a lot of this. They've told about tankers being caught with a ton of cocaine, as in the 1990s. CIA has been drug trafficking for decades, and they were caught again in the 2000s, and this is the way things have happened. And so when you get all that drug dealing off the street, you really affect the money of these drug traffickers in the CIA, and the money that's made from laundering it in the banks and the corporations that are part of the stock market that also launder a lot of this drug money.
Well,
so billions of dollars being affected.
The psychedelic phase is asked, did the Las Vegas police not investigate because of government improvements to the public infrastructure in Las Vegas? That's another claim I'm not aware of.
No, the Las Vegas police didn't investigate because the way U.S. intelligence works is you got the highest levels of CIA, who are the head of the CIA is supervises all other 14 plus intelligence directors. And then you got, one of those intelligence agencies under the CIA is the FBI. And then the FBI overlaps local police intelligence units. So Las Vegas would have had a police intelligence unit. Los Angeles has a much bigger police intelligence unit, as does New York City. And New York City and Los Angeles police intelligence units, it was found by the Miami Herald. First thing it was found in Labyrinth, in the book Labyrinth, that there was a New York City police officer investigating Biggie Smalls' murder, who took pictures of Biggie when he died. who also was a member of the FBI. Okay, and this also came out in Biggie and Tupac. His name was Detective Oldham.
John, I'm afraid we've just run out of time. We managed to open a whole can of worms with a minute to go. So, I mean, maybe with the few seconds left, you could just let people know where they can find your book and the rest of your work.
Sure. So go to johnpotash.com, JOHNPOTASH.com, and you can find the books and films, Drugs as Weapons Against Us, and the FBI War on Tupac Shakur, State Repression of Black Leaders. Drugs as Weapons Against Us covers other musicians such as John Lennon, Kurt Cobain, and Jimi Hendrix, as well as the Kennedys and others. So I hope people read more and see my sources for this information.
Thank you very much for speaking to us. I've learned a lot. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks a lot, Steve. Thanks for having me on.
Take care.
Bye.
Just going to bring in our next guest for the evening, Dino. Thank you for joining us. How are you, sir?
Hi, Stephen. I'm very good. Thank you for having me.
Good stuff. It's been very American centric tonight, so it's nice to hear a friendly accent.
Good.
Maybe you can tell us a little bit about Lee Day Solicitors and what you do there.
Yeah, so I'm a partner and a solicitor at Lee Day, specialising in representing abuse survivors. We only act on behalf of claimants for numerous different issues, but we're one of the leading human rights law firms in the country. And myself, I specialise in representing child abuse survivors predominantly, and especially within sport.
All right, there's a lot to unpack there then, and I appreciate as well you spend a lot of time with people who have been abused at the hands of the Catholic Church and things like that. And I mean that issue obviously was going on a long time before it was exposed. I assume it's probably continued in various forms since. And I just wondering how would you best describe this issue to give people an idea of the scale of it, because I think it feels like it's become so large in that sense that a lot of people are actually numb to it in terms of the scale. So I mean, how widespread was this issue with the Catholic Church, and how widespread is it rather?
Yeah, I think when most people consider something like child abuse, they do think of the Catholic Church, or they think of something as being historical. And this is the only crime we use that word, historical child abuse. We don't say historical murder, historical burglary, historical theft. It's only child abuse because obviously it happened in the past. It's happened in a different area, a different time. It doesn't happen now. And you're right, Stephen, it does. And the simple truth is that wherever there's an adult in a position of trust over a child, there's a risk of abuse. And now that may be the Catholic Church. It may be other religions. It may be private schools, state schools, boarding schools, Scout Association, military cadets, any sport you can think of. It may be in the family home. It may be by strangers. Maybe by politicians, police officers, doctors, nurses, anywhere where you think a child is in contact with an adult. Sadly, they're at risk of abuse. We do see abuse happening, and that continues to the current day, sadly.
Yeah, and in what ways do you provide support for? I mean, is it primarily focused around the victims or survivors, however you prefer to term it? Are you dealing with sort of institutions as well to help make them more aware of how they can be attuned to it?
Yeah, so we represent abuse survivors in legal actions, often against institutions. Now, the reason for that is that they've been through something which is horrendous and clearly wrong, and that needs to be addressed. They need to get some form of accountability, closure, justice, whatever word you want to use, but they deserve answers. We also do a lot of campaigning with our clients. We do a lot of media work, try to expose this issue. And what we're really keen to do is to raise awareness, expose the issue, signpost where we can. But so much is really important. We need to break the cycle. We can't just keep on hearing the same, in quotation marks, scandals, whether it's abuse in football or abuse in the Catholic Church. We need to break the cycle. Otherwise, the next generation will be at the same risk of abuse as our generation is or were. So that's what we're really keen to do, tighten the laws, really make sure that people are punished for committing these crimes, because otherwise nothing changes. Same story, different day. It's just not good enough.
I totally agree. I mean, you made a great point when we started talking then about the, referencing, the atrocities carried out by members of the Catholic Church, which is historic. And I suppose in a way as well, I mean, how difficult is it to get justice for people where the crimes perpetrated against them were some time ago? I mean, we just had that, Jimmy Savile docudrama starring Steve Coogan there. And, one of the most frustrating things about that whole, I was going to say scandal there, but you warned off that word, so I use atrocity. That whole issue was that he never faced justice while he was alive, and a lot of these people, it took them a long time to come forward and speak up because of the shame, the stigma, and things like that. And how much more difficult is it to get justice for these people if there's a huge passage of time?
Yeah, just with the scandal point, by the way, the reason why it's so important is that journalists want to get exposure for these issues, and it's right to do so. But the exposure is just one part. The scandal is just that. And actually, you're not looking at the impact on someone's life. You're not looking at the considerations of how it happened, why did it happen, how did it happen for so long. So that's the reason why I pick up on the word scandal. In relation to the time point you mentioned, it is harder. But it's an inherent part of the crime in that compared to most crimes, people report relatively soon after. So if someone stabbed you today, I would hope, Stephen, that number one, you tell a doctor, get treatment, and hopefully tell the police. Tell your friends, tell family. If someone stole your TV, I hope you wouldn't allow them to nick other stuff from your house. Again, tell the police. It's such a unique crime, and it does make it more difficult. But the simple truth is that we know, sadly, from abusers, even though they make you feel that you're the only one they abuse, we know they abuse others. And whether that's teachers or Savile, this is the brutal nature of that crime. It's not one individual. It's not one day. They will abuse numerous individuals over a significant period of time, and yet somehow no one's aware. No one's conscious of that child changing in personality, their lives being affected, and as a result, the abuse and the abusers can continue. It is hard, but it's possible, and this is which we really strive to do for all of our clients. But it's not possible for everyone. Of course, it's a really difficult area to kind of explore and to try to help people with.
Yeah, I mean, maybe you could just help us explore the psychology of this a little bit in terms of, a young adult or an adolescent or somebody underage who's being abused by somebody. Obviously, there's a power dynamic element there, and you'll often hear people say they felt like they were doing something wrong. The victim were doing something wrong. There's a lot of shame that comes with it, a lot of stigma. What is the psychology there that kind of explains this kind of thing, where somebody could be experience some of the most horrific forms of abuse, but they internalize it as perhaps their fault?
Yeah, I think that when we consider most abuse happens, let's say between 10 and 15, those 5 years are the most important 5 years of your life. They are when you change from a child to a teenager to a young adult. It's when you define who you are as a person, what kind of friends you like, what music you're interested in, what your diet is, what your sexuality is, your career, your GCSEs, how well do you do? Will you go to university or not? Those 5 years are more important than 30 to 35 years old, 20 to 25. You choose any of the 5 years. So for something like this to happen, often it's your first sexual experience. It's your first feelings of emotion to someone else. It's very confusing at that period of time. And for someone to have access to money or a car or to take interest in you, it is really confusing. And to have feelings, physical feelings sometimes, it's very confusing. But to also feel trapped, who do you speak to? Who do you reach out to? Can you tell your parents who may be very religious? Can you tell teachers who may blame you? Again, victim blaming applies as much to child abuse as it does to women and other adults who suffer abuse. Why did you go back? Did you enjoy it? Why didn't you fight him off? Are you homosexual? These are the things which people are asked and people are worried about. And that just continues and continues and continues. Sometimes survivors are being told, don't tell anyone. No one will believe you. If you do, I'll kill myself. If you do, your parents will hate you. All of these things feed into this psychology whereby it's my word against someone else's. And remember, they're not equal, like you mentioned. It's someone in a position of power, trust, and authority. It's someone who's been able to manipulate not just the child, but the local community, in that everyone believes in them. They're not some weirdo in a park. They are your school teacher. It's your parents' priest. It's the really popular football coach. They're not weirdos. They're normal people. They're not monsters. They're operating in normal society. So how can you go against them? Who would believe you as a child? And do you want to have to deal with the fallout, the potential fallout, and the potential impact on your life and your career and your parents? And you're 10 to 15 years old. It is so much on those very small shoulders. And still in 2023, that pressure is still on you. There is no mandatory report in this country. There's no legal duty on people in positions of trust to report on these issues. It's still left on you as a child to deal with that, deal with the repercussions. And often it's just too much. Lots of survivors will never report. And those who do, on average, report about 30 years after the crime. So when they're roughly 40. And going back to your example, if you were being stabbed, Stephen, if you didn't get treated for 30 years, your injuries would be so much worse. You may not go out as much. Other parts of your body may be affected. And that's what happened to survivors. And then they self-medicate. And then this permeates this cycle of pain, drink, drugs, self-harm, suicide attempts. And then you still need to disclose the most private and painful things in your entire life. And once it's out, it's out. You can't put it back inside the box. So that is some of the psychology, why abuse survivors find it so difficult to talk. And it's why it's often so difficult to get justice for them. But we need to do as much as we can. And that's why I'm so grateful for you and Shaun for being able, allowing me to speak and to raise these issues. It's so important to break the taboo of abuse.
It's entirely our pleasure. Seems like a wrong expression to use for such serious injustices. But I mean, you're obviously the one doing the important work here, and that was a really eloquent and comprehensive answer to my question. So thank you for that. I just wanted to get your opinion as well on where we are in terms of society or the climate, because it feels like there has been a lot of consciousness raising, awareness raising of child abusers, people like that. It seems like the press went mental on the issue for the longest time, where they were everywhere in bushes. Everybody was one. I think pediatricians' houses were being attacked and things like that because people couldn't read properly. And so it felt a little bit like maybe the society had made progress on this in terms of it would have been harder to keep hush. But then you kind of throw in the advent of the internet into it, social media, online gaming, other forms where, abusers don't even need to leave the house to sort of groom and get the hooks into, potentially vulnerable people. I'm just wondering how are you dealing with that aspect of it? How much has it changed the climate, this globally interconnected social network that we all have in our pockets now?
Yeah, well, just dealing with the first aspect, teachers, doctors and the like, I think the media did raise awareness, but one thing which is really important is that abusers don't operate in silos or, little bubbles. The system allows abuse to permeate and to take place. And what I mean by that is that we're not, enabling abusers, but often we're failing to pick up on the signs, we're failing to stop abuse. You have an abusive teacher, we'll let you go. You have an abusive priest, let's move him to another diocese. That is enabling abuse to continue. And we do need to look at the systematic failings which take place. In relation to your question, again, I'm not a politician, or definitely not yet, so I'll answer your question directly. In relation to online abuse, you are right. It's a totally different beast because it could be anyone, anywhere, and not just children in Britain, but children across the globe who could be being abused. For you are getting the access to those images and videos, and they may never know, we may never know who those children are. And that is terrifying. And I think that, the internet is an amazing thing. Social media is fantastic, but in the wrong hands, it can do horrendous things. And what we are seeing is a huge issue where lots of men, most abusers are men, the vast majority, 98, 99% of sexual abusers are men who are viewing these images. But the key thing is, how do we A, stop them getting access? And the second thing is B, when we do find out, do we punish them? And what we do see, with total respect to the criminal justice system, far too many of these people get suspended sentences because we didn't actually harm a child, you didn't touch a child. But a child is being harmed for you to get that sexual gratification. Surely the sentencing should be stricter. Now, sometimes it comes down to finances, sometimes it comes down to capacity. Our prisons are full, as reported last week. Now, that may be an excuse, but it's not a good enough reason. And I think that if we know there's an issue, which there is, online abuse and viewing of these images, it is an issue. We need to do more. We need to start really working with and against potentially social media platforms to tighten the loopholes. No one should want people viewing child abuse imagery online. It should be black and white. There are no ifs or buts. There's no arguments about free speech or anything else. It's wrong. Block it. And when those men are found to view those images, we do need to punish them. We do need to set down a clear deterrent and to show this is wrong. Because otherwise you get a slap on the wrist, which is, as a lawyer, you should be careful using those phrases, but a suspended sentence isn't a true punishment for your crimes, in my personal view. And for lots of my clients who have suffered this, it doesn't do justice to what's happened and the kind of infiltration of their personal lives. So we should be doing a lot more. I think the law could be being a lot harder on those who view child abuse images. And they should be doing that sooner rather than later, because we have got a real problem with it.
I imagine you would have a lot of public support for that motion if you were a politician, for sure. I mean, just looking into other areas that you focus on as well, like you mentioned earlier in the conversation, sport as well is a big focus. What kind of things do you focus on there, and what kind of issues do you come across?
So in sport, obviously we've had abuse in football exposed in 2016, 2017. We've had abuse in gymnastics and swimming. But again, we rely often for scandals to take place in the media to enable people to come forward. So when people came forward for abuse in football in 2016 onwards, it took a number of years for people to come forward for abuse in swimming and gymnastics. And, we did a work with Amazon Prime for abuse in tennis, for example. It takes time, but what is really interesting from a psychology perspective, most people consider an abuse survivor to be someone who is not someone who does sport. Someone who does sport is popular and fit and physically strong. They're not someone who's, termed, when people consider who an abuse survivor is, they have a very much of a stereotype of someone who's a victim and a survivor. And actually, anyone can suffer abuse. So the abuse in sport is a real issue. Each sport has different standards of care and levels of care as well. But there's been a significant number of sports which have been affected, to be frank. And it's really hard to find a sport which hasn't been affected by sexual abuse of children.
Well, I mean, just to walk you through a political minefield here, which I apologize for in advance. I mean, you mentioned something which is, factually true earlier, that the overwhelming perpetrators of these crimes on average are men. That's indisputable. And because of that, there are various safeguarding processes that are quite important. And amongst those, I would imagine, would be single sex spaces. Now, there's a big debate raging, certainly in the UK at the moment. People who I suppose would be designated trans exclusionary radical feminist, they would describe themselves as maybe gender critical, would say single sex spaces are absolutely paramount to reduce the chances of abuse like this, certain amount of abuse happening. I'm just wondering, is that something you give a thought to with these new rules regarding perhaps self-identification and biological men having access to sort of female changing rooms and things like that? Is that something that flags up as a potential issue for what you do?
I think where as an adult around children or females, there's a risk. I think that's definitely true. The one thing which is really important is to consider the level of risk and proportionality. So the question is, if you have 100 people, how many of them identify as trans, and where is the risk? And I think that, again, with total respect to the media, often the focus is on the risk or perceived risk of transsexuals. There's been lots of transsexuals obviously are not sex offenders and are not risks to children, to be frank. And that's what the research dictates and data and so on. But the numbers of men who can sexually abuse and do sexually abuse children are so much higher. And I think that what we need to consider is turn it on its head rather than looking at, the key thing is protection of children and making sure they're safe. The greatest risk to children, based on everything which we know, are men in positions of trust. That's the simple truth. That is the biggest risk. And the system which enables someone who's a male or trans or whatever else, that system allows them all to perpetrate that and to commit the abuse and to fall through those loopholes. Those loopholes need to be tightened for everyone. And that's not me dodging your question or dodging this issue. I just think that that is where the focus is. Again, the media can divert your attention to specific issues, but the greatest number of men in prison right now for child sexual abuse are men, are males. That is the simple truth. That's the biggest risk. So that's where most of my focus is. And now that's not saying that there's not areas. I'm not saying that women are not abusers. They are. There are a number of women who are in prison for child sexual abuse as well. But the most focus, due to limited resources and time and ability to get people's attention and to get the media and get journalists' attention, we have to focus on the biggest risk. And that is, sadly, men in positions of trust.
Okay. Fair enough. Well, I mean, in terms of these roles, so if we're talking about like scouts, teachers, community leaders, people who would primarily focus on helping children, perhaps vulnerable children, these are some of the greatest people on the planet for some of the work they do, you know, and their intentions are pure, and they really, you know, they're full of empathy and they really want to help and they wouldn't harm a child. Unfortunately, another tragic aspect of this whole thing really is that a lot of them jobs do actually appeal to people who are sex offenders because, to put it really crassly, the lions want to be where the lambs are, I suppose. And do we have an issue there then of like, you know, there's far too many scandals with the priesthood, so people are now, you know, weary of all priests. There's one scout leader too many has been guilty of something, so the scouts is now in disrepute. I mean, how do we find that proportional balance between protecting people and not wanting people to think that every teacher's a threat, for instance?
Yeah, no, so you're right. Not everyone is, and there's some amazing. Most teachers are amazing. You know, the thing they can do constantly, and the improvement and difference can make people's lives is fantastic. Same as a really good football coach, scout leader. They can really add to that child, who then adds to society. So it's really good for the societal benefits. So I totally agree with that. The issue which I have, however, is that it's not the abusers. Again, it's looking at the system. If the reason why the Catholic Church is targeted so much is that they have been known to move priests around who have had allegations of abuse against them. It's the cover-up which kills you constantly, whatever it is. Whether it's murder, you kill someone, but then you cover it up by whatever means. It's that cover-up which is the thing which really aggravates people and really makes things worse. And the same is with teachers and football coaches and priests and the like. It's when you mentioned the good priests, why did the good priests allow the bad priest to move somewhere else and we no longer probably abuse someone else? Why in Nazi Germany did good Germans turn a blind eye? It was for fear of repercussions, you know, fear of death, etc. I don't think you can say to me a Catholic priest in Newcastle is at fear of death for not reporting on a priest. A teacher in Swindon can't be at fear of death either. So what's stopping them? And that's the reason why it's really important, again, to that psychology. What is stopping you from acting on those accusations, those allegations, those concerns? Because when good people do bad things, we're screwed. The safeguarding of children is screwed. We don't have any chance, because instead we go back to that first thing you said. It's down to a child to report all over again. And I'm saying to you, it's too much. So if the good people, the people which we both know, those teachers and priests and coaches, can do the right thing, they will remain good people in my eyes. Until that point, there are doubts. And this is why the Catholic Church has such a big problem, because it's been such a big issue in this country, in America and Argentina, for moving dodgy priests around, as they're termed. They're child abusers, you know, and, you know, I know you need to forgive and forget, and we should not be vengeful and all of that. I know that. But surely where a child's suffering abuse and you put them at risk of suffering further abuse, you're doing the wrong thing. And that will taint you forever, because the system is flawed. And that's the reason why certain organizations have problems, because they fail children.
Yeah. And I kind of appreciate this a few bad apples kind of perspective when it comes to sort of teachers, scouts, things like that. But just to lead you through another minefield again, Dino, in terms of the Catholic Church, if I'm to put on my, 2008 Richard Dawkins, the God Delusion phase, I would potentially point at the Catholic Church and say, well, some of the doctrines and the culture there around and attitudes towards sex and the threat of hellfire and prohibition against masturbation and celibacy and all these kind of, abnormal, strict dogmas, etc., is a potential breeding ground for this kind of sexual abnormal behavior and preying on the young and things like that. And I'm just wondering if you, given how widespread it is in the Catholic Church, is there a causal link we can make between the dogmas of the Church and some of the behavior we're witnessing from their clergy?
So it's a really good question. So there are 3 things to pick up on. So 1, no sex before marriage as a Catholic, okay?
Yeah.
So you're a child and a priest has raped you, has had sexual intercourse with you. Can you tell anyone? I've had this issue with Catholics and Mormons and other religions because you're no longer pure. It's just be a virgin until you're married. It's a real issue, even though this has been done to you. It's not sex, you've been raped, but they will still say, well, it's still sexual intercourse. That stops survivors talking. The second is the power of a confession. A priest can go into a confessional and say something. They're not under a duty to report it. And often they don't. They never do. Because this whole point is when you go to a confessional, whatever you say stays in there. So again, the priest can feel relieved. Oh, I finally told someone, yes, I raped a child. I did this. But I know it's not going to go anywhere. Do 10 Hail Marys and crack on with your day. That's an issue. Those are 2 issues, which again, silence abuse. The third thing is there was a study done in the Vatican state. So obviously the Vatican state's in the middle of Rome. It's a country, but it's well, it is a country technically. But they looked into the computer history of priests, and they did find a high level of pornography. Now, as priests, a Catholic priest, you're not supposed to have sex, you're not supposed to masturbate or anything else. So you're not viewing pornography for the artistic value, with total respect, to be totally crude. So if they knew this, what did they do about it? They just turned a blind eye. Now, going back to your original question, does this extreme nature is it just so unnatural that they will develop urges and they will go down this path? Or do they already have these urges and say, well, look, I have a bad urge. I know I should not commit child abuse. Therefore, I'll become a priest. I'll be celibate for the rest of my life. It doesn't work. There's a number of priests, again, in Italy who will have sex with widows. There was a news issue about 2 years ago. It was a high prevalence. Again, Catholic priests cannot have sex. They have sex with widows because obviously their husbands have just died. It's in essence a perfect crime because who's going to, a widow's not going to say, by the way, my husband's dead. I've just had sex with my priest. He's only been buried 6 months or 3 months, whatever it is. It's an issue. And I think the point of celibacy, it is an inherent question. If religion is about God and purity and about doing good and being a good person, which most religions are, to be frank, if you follow these rules, you'll be a good person, you'll be pure. That's the most essence of religion. It should be. Why does sex have to come into it for? Why does the Catholic religion, why are they so obsessed by sex and being celibate, no sex before marriage, no abortion, sex should only be to procreate, and all these other things? Why does that make you a good person or a bad person? I understand don't murder someone. I understand don't cheat on someone. I understand those. Obviously, those are bad things, and I get that. But they do have an obsession about sex, potentially, which is abnormal. And as a result, if you're brought up in a Catholic family, you're abused by a Catholic priest, you're an altar server, your views on sex can become extremely deviated or normal. And if you do suffer abuse, then it's so much harder to disclose and to talk about it.
I mean, that's another really thoughtful answer, Dino. Thank you. I'm just wondering, do they have strong enough checks in place in schools and sporting bodies for maybe, catching out coaches that have been in trouble in different areas of the country before? Is there a good system in place for that?
So DBS checks, the kind of criminal record checks, only catch you obviously if you've been reported and acted on. And I think that there are lots of other things where sporting bodies could act. So you may not face criminal repercussions, but you may be banned from a sport, football, for example, or tennis. But it's not known about. And I think it's really important if you have been banned for a sport for improper behavior, as recently done in gymnastics. Last week, they named and shamed lots of coaches being banned. You should know that. It may not be the level of a criminal action for indecent assault or other sexual offences, but it's inappropriate behaviour around children. It's a huge question mark about you. And not only should you be banned from the sport, but people should know about it. This isn't people throwing tomatoes at you. This is actually just saying there's a concern about this individual. You should be careful around them. We need to do that, because the alternative is just to hope everything's fine, put the head in the sand. But a child will suffer abuse because we fail to act as society.
Well, Dino, I've learned a lot. You're obviously very passionate and knowledgeable about what you do, and I appreciate your incredibly thoughtful answers. Maybe you could just let people know where they can find out more of your work and how they can support it.
Yeah, so I'm available on Twitter, which is now called X at the point of this publication. I'm on Facebook, LinkedIn. My contact details, I'm sure, can be shared. And if anyone's got any questions or queries, then please do ask. And I really appreciate you listening and speaking to me, Stephen. And if I ever get the opportunity again, I'd be really keen to do it, because I think it's really important what you were doing. So thank you.
Absolutely, our pleasure. Thank you, Dino. Have a lovely evening.
You too. Take care. Bye.
Take care.
Yeah, it definitely is important. The only way we can stop this kind of, let's just say, behavior is by shining a light on it and knowing the ins and outs, what goes on, methods used, etc. So it is very important work. Huge thank you to Dino for coming on. And Dino's links, all the guest links are in the description box. Stephen Knight's links are in the description box. Please support his work. Ash has informed me that Locals has crashed again tonight. He's devastated. So I am going to be doing a pre-record. The scheduled interview that was on Locals is going to be a pre-record now. It is a Twin Towers episode, 1 hour long, and it should be up on Locals within 24 hours. And Ash said he appreciates, as I do, all the people who've gone over to Locals. I think we've got a couple of thousand over there right now. We've got a great community. So we're just waiting to kick off these live streams over there as well. And once we get this sorted out, we should be on a roll from thence on out. So anything in conclusion, Stephen?
Just another great lineup of guests on Attwood Unleashed. I really enjoyed that. It's always good when people are incredibly knowledgeable and you get to learn something from them as well. This has been a free education for me, again.
And what have you got coming up on your Substack this week?
Nothing as of yet, but I did attend a protest in Liverpool last Sunday and got some great footage of protesters v some women's rights activists. That's on my YouTube channel if people want to check that out. Well worth your time.
All the links in the description. Much love and respect wherever you are in the world. Huge thank you to Stephen Knight and Ash.